be made on a substantive motion drawn in the proper terms. Today's debate is on a neutral motion that the House has considered the specific matter. It is not a substantive motion. I encourage all members to engage in respectful debate as our constituents would exist. We now come to the emergency debate. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of the government's accountability to the House in connection to the appointment of Peter Mandelson. And can I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this important debate. The Prime Minister personally decided to appoint a serious, known national security risk to our most sensitive diplomatic post. Peter Mandelson was not just a man who had already been sacked twice from government for lying, not just a man who had a public relationship with a convicted paedophile, but a man with links to the Kremlin and China, links so close that they were raised as red flags with the Prime Minister before his appointment. Yesterday, the Prime Minister did not deny that he knew about these links before he appointed Mandelson. He could not deny this because, by his own admission, he had seen the documents that proved the links. I cannot overstate how serious a matter this is. The Prime Minister sent a known security risk to Washington, to a position where he would see our most important allies' top secret intelligence. What if he had seen something and leaked it to one of our enemies? How much would that have damaged our security partnership? We cannot even be sure that didn't happen. What is most extraordinary is the Prime Minister appointed Peter Mandelson before vetting was complete. He did this despite a letter from the then Cabinet Secretary, Lord Keir, clearly expressing to the Prime Minister that the process required security vetting to be done before the appointment. So how can he then have claimed on the floor of this House that the process was followed, when he knew that it had not been? He mentioned the word process, Mr. Speaker, more than 100 times in Parliament yesterday, but he was the one who didn't follow that process. Yes. This morning, we have heard the bombshell testimony of the former Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Office, Sir Olly Robbins. Sir Olly Robbins had a long and distinguished career serving ministers. He is not the sort of person to give us a frank personal account of how things played out last January. So when he told us today that Downing Street put the Foreign Office under constant pressure to clear Peter Mandelson, that Number 10 showed a dismissive approach to Mandelson's vetting process, when he told us that it would have been very difficult indeed to deny clearance and that doing so would have damaged US-UK relationships, we know he is giving us the slightest indication of how bad things were. That there was actually an overwhelming drive from the Prime Minister's office to ensure Peter Mandelson was installed as ambassador. He has told us that Number 10 showed no interest in the vetting, no desire to wait and ensure due process was followed. In fact, the Cabinet Office even questioned the need for Peter Mandelson to be vetted at all. The same Cabinet Office that had discovered Mandelson's links to Epstein, China and Russia in its due diligence. The Cabinet Office which the Minister is in charge of right now. Instead, Mr. Speaker, according to Robbins, the focus was on getting Mandelson out to Washington quickly. And before the vetting even started, Peter Mandelson had already been granted access to, and I quote, highly classified briefing on a case-by-case basis. This is what the Prime Minister calls full due process. Now, yes, I will give way.
Also in the testimony today, did she not find it astonishing that, that the ex-leader of the Foreign Office said that he was made to understand that before they had completed their clearances, that Mandelson already had strap clearance, which gives him access to the most secure and most dangerous information held by government?
Can I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention? He is absolutely right. It is extraordinary. It is shocking. Now, the Prime Minister might have refused to answer my question around his knowledge of Mandelson's links to the Russian defence company Sistema yesterday, but that is only because he knows we know the answer. It was there in the due diligence. His choice of ambassador, retaining an interest in a Russian company linked to Vladimir Putin after the invasion of Crimea. And the Prime Minister's response to seeing that information? According to Robbins, constant pressure on the Foreign Office to get the appointment done. The Prime Minister, as my right honourable friend has just mentioned, placed top-secret intelligence in the hands of a man he knew to be a national security risk. He did so before the official security vetting, not just knowingly, but deliberately, and to an extent that left a senior civil servant with a distinguished career under the clear and obvious impression that the vetting must return only one possible outcome, that Peter Mandelson was appointed. None of this was following full due process, by the letter or the spirit of that phrase. This is no longer just about what the Prime Minister was or wasn't told. This is about what he did before the vetting process had even started. And we now know that Mandelson wasn't a one-off. According to Sir Olly Robbins, number 10 also asked for the disgraced Matthew Doyle, the Prime Minister's then Director of Communications, to be made an ambassador. Astonishingly, the Prime Minister's office even told Robbins to keep this request a secret from the Foreign Secretary. The idea that it is number 10 who are the victims of others not following due process is quite frankly laughable. The Prime Minister told Parliament yesterday that it was staggering that Olly Robbins had not shared the recommendations of the UK security vetting with the then Cabinet Secretary, Chris Wormold. But today, we learned from Robbins that he had never seen the original vetting file. So if the Prime Minister is furious that Sir Olly Robbins did not share the vetting details with him or the former Cabinet Secretary, why is he not furious with the Cabinet Office for not sharing it? Put simply, why exactly did he sack Olly Robbins? It is no surprise the Prime Minister is not here today. These are difficult questions. He cannot claim not to have known about the risk Mandelson posed because he saw the due diligence that disclosed it, as he said yesterday. I still find it inconceivable that despite that failure of vetting being a front-page news story, no one in number 10 was aware of it. He cannot deny that his decision put Britain at risk, and the British public deserve to know how this failure happened, and they deserve to hear it from the Prime Minister himself. Yesterday, he had the chance to set the record straight, but members on all sides, and no doubt the public, were left wholly unsatisfied with the answers he gave. I am sure they will share my deep disappointment that the Prime Minister has chosen not to be here today. There remain serious questions about the decisions he took over the appointment of Peter Mandelson, but the Prime Minister does not want to answer any more questions today, and so in typical fashion, he has thrown someone else under the bus. So I feel for the Minister sent out as a human shield for the Prime Minister. It's not this Minister who made the Mandelson appointment. That was above his pay grade. He cannot tell us what the Prime Minister was thinking when he made those decisions, and he will not be able to provide this House with the answers it deserves to hear. But this is simply what the Prime Minister does. Sue Gray, Matthew Doyle, Morgan McSweeney, Chris Wormold, Olly Robbins, Peter Mandelson. These appointments were the Prime Minister's decision, people the Prime Minister chose to appoint, and all people he then chose to sack. Are we meant to believe that all these people are the problem rather than the Prime Minister's judgment? As usual, his explanations yesterday left us with even more questions than answers. He says that he was justified in appointing Mandelson before vetting because of advice he received from the then Cabinet Secretary, Chris Wormold. But how can this make sense when that advice only came after the scandal had erupted? Post hoc advice is pointless. Soon after this, he then sacked Chris Wormold. So why is the Prime Minister now relying on the evidence of the very man he told us was doing so badly in the job that he sacked him? But let's move on to the Prime Minister's claim that no one in number 10 was aware that Mandelson had failed his vetting. Because enough people in Whitehall knew, enough people knew for journalists from The Independent, The Mail and Sky News to find out. Journalists have released texts with the Prime Minister's Director of Communications where they made number 10 aware of this fact. He did not deny this story was true. Why not? Something simply doesn't add up. Despite this, the Prime Minister went on to assure this House, to assure the public, that Mandelson's appointment was down to a failure of vetting. I cannot fathom how the Prime Minister can still claim not to have misled the House on this point. It is telling that when given the opportunity to apologise for misleading the House, even inadvertently, by my honourable friend for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk yesterday, he chose not to. I suspect that he chose not to because he knows that if he did, he would be bound by his own words, bound by the standards to which he held previous Prime Ministers from this very dispatch box. In 2022, he said that if the Prime Minister misleads the House, he must resign. Either he is a man of his word, or he thinks there is one rule for him and another for everyone else. Mr. Speaker, unbelievably, half of the permanent secretaries who were in post when Labour took office less than 2 years ago have gone. The sacking of senior civil servants to carry the can for the Prime Minister's failures has already cost taxpayers more than £1.5 million in payouts. This is before Sir Olly Robbins. It is quite something for the former Cabinet Secretary, Lord O'Donnell, to warn that the Prime Minister has created one of the worst crises in relations between ministers and mandarins of modern times. He said that the sacking of Sir Olly Robbins risks having a serious and sustained chilling effect on serving and prospective civil servants. Another former Cabinet Secretary, Lord Butler, has said the Prime Minister put Sir Olly in an impossible position.
Yeah, he did.
These are serious people who are calling out the Prime Minister's behaviour. The former head of propriety and ethics and deputy to the Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara, has called the decision to sack Robbins unacceptable. She said that if they had published the papers that Parliament demanded back in February, that's the government, if they'd published that, this argument would be so much easier for everyone because we would all be operating on the same basis, the same facts. She's right. The delay in publishing the information required by the humble address is shocking. Where are the key annotations? Where are the decisions and meeting records? The box returns, as they are called, in Downing Street. Why are crucial forms left blank? These missing documents add to the mystery. Why is the government still trying to cover this up? Yes, I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. She will remember I asked the Prime Minister yesterday in the box note of the 11th of November, where Simon Case recommended that vetting went through before the appointment was made. The Prime Minister's decision note did not include the Prime Minister's decision, and it's been redacted from the conditions of the humble address. Does she think that the answer that has been redacted would show what the Prime Minister was trying to achieve by appointing Peter Mandelson without the appropriate vetting?
Can I thank my honourable friend for that intervention? He is absolutely right. Why were the Prime Minister's words redacted? These are key pieces of information that will help solve this mystery. Much easier for us to see and understand the words which he was giving at the dispatch box. I note that no Labour MPs have intervened on me. This is very unusual. Normally, when I'm standing here in a debate, they're all bobbing left, right and centre. Mr. Speaker, I'm raising these concerns because of the seriousness of the situation the country is now in. With war in Europe, war in the Middle East, a cost of living crisis and a global energy shock, we need a Prime Minister who has a grip on national security. Yet last week, the former Labour Defence Secretary and former NATO Secretary-General, Lord Robertson, warned that the Prime Minister had a corrosive complacency when it comes to defence. This is the same man who wrote the Prime Minister's Strategic Defence Review. He is ringing the alarm bell, warning us of the grave consequences of the government refusing to take the tough choices needed to increase defence spending. This matters because if we cannot trust our Prime Minister to tell the truth about this ambassadorial appointment, the whole, full truth, a key appointment in Britain's national security architecture, it calls into question the assurances he gives us on everything else. His promises to control taxes, which he has broken. His promises not to raise borrowing, which he has broken. Promises to back business, protect our veterans, defend our farmers, and prioritise growth, all of which he has broken. And he has broken them because at his core, he is a man with no idea what he believes. Worse still, he appears to have no interest in doing the job of Prime Minister, just in being the Prime Minister. Curiosity is what drives serious leadership. Without curiosity, problems are neither fully understood nor solved. And this whole affair just goes to show why this country is heading in such a woeful direction under the Prime Minister's incurious regime. His defence yesterday summed it up. He says that no one told him and that he never thought to ask. This is, in his own words, incredible. But even if we take the Prime Minister at his word, even if we believe the unbelievable, it is no better. He appointed Mandelson despite knowing that he was a threat to our national security. He said due process was followed, having failed to follow that process himself, and he pressured the Foreign Office into signing off on this appointment. In 2022, the Prime Minister said, "I believe that if you're the leader, the buck stops with you." He said, "I will always stand up for my team, but I will also take responsibility for everything they do." That is what leadership is. How has he taken responsibility? It is clear that the Prime Minister has no intention of facing up to his mistakes. It's clear now that he is not a leader and he has no intention of doing the honourable thing.
On that point, will the Right Honourable Lady give way?
Yes, I will give way.
I congratulate her on securing this debate and indeed on eviscerating the Prime Minister in her speech. Does she not believe, however, that the sorry souls opposite us should have to put their money where their mouth is and that there should be a vote of no confidence in this Prime Minister in due course?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a very good point. I think he is right, because I don't believe the Prime Minister has the intention of doing the honourable thing himself, even though that's the standard to which he held everyone else. The decision, as I said, about whether he will ultimately take responsibility for his actions is now up to Labour MPs. We heard many powerful statements from that side of the House yesterday. Labour MPs know that the Prime Minister has let the country down, he's let Parliament down, and he's also let the Labour Party down. It is clear to everyone, except the Prime Minister himself, that he has failed on his own terms. It is clear to the public that he is failing at the job. It is clear to civil servants that he is throwing them under the bus. And it is clear to members across this House that he is not fit to lead. This cannot go on. This House deserves better. The country deserves better. The Prime Minister is not fit for office. The first duty, Mr. Speaker, of any Prime Minister is to keep this country safe. This Prime Minister has put the country's national security at risk. He must take responsibility. It is time for him to go.
The question is, as on the order paper, John Trickett.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And there are many ways of developing a culture how to run the government in Number 10. I was a witness in the years from the financial crash through to the defeat of the Labour government between 2008 and 2010. And I saw a Prime Minister who would never have come to Parliament or said privately that there were some facts of which he was unaware, because he was a man of detail. He was a man of a large vision, and he's a man who drove the state forward. Now, we may disagree, and I do personally, with some of the decisions he took, but that is a different culture than the one which the two previous Prime Ministers, Truss and our friend who, with his blonde hair, used to offer a culture in Number 10 of the exotic. And we went from the exotic to the toxic. And the fact of the matter is, I did not hear members on the opposite side asking questions about the culture of those two Prime Ministers that are here today in great numbers. They contributed to the mess which this country...
Mr Turner, the man is speaking, you just walked right in front. Sorry, John Tricker.
Mr Speaker. So those two Prime Ministers in particular, the chaotic and the exotic, left this country in a disastrous situation. But I do think that a Prime Minister who comes to the House and relies or implies that he relies on a culture of simply process is mistaken. I think the Gordon Brown model, flawed as it was, will be far better than the one which we've heard of from the Prime Minister. I'm sorry to say that, because I want to support a Labour government that's effective. But that is the case. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw the vetting, I saw the decisions, I saw the pressure, I saw the tumult, and I saw Prime Ministers struggling with a party to deliver a different kind of society, a different kind of economy. Now, let me just turn to the present events. What did we learn from Sir Olly today? I think there are four things which matter. First, that the Security Department had tended to be wanting to refuse the vetting of Mandelson when Sir Olly first arrived, although others had said we don't need a vetting of any kind. And then, whilst the vetting process was going on, the government proceeded with or appeared to proceed with the appointment of Mandelson. And even the King and the United States administration were told that he would be the ambassador. The British state then conspired to deliver a positive vetting because that is what they believed the government wanted. And that was expressed in repeated phone calls from the private office in Number 10, which I was very familiar with in those years, to Sir Olly's private office. The pressure, according to the witness we saw this morning, who looked credible, made a very serious case that he was under pressure to proceed. And no, I'm going to make progress. There are many people standing on all sides, and it may well be pleased with some of the things I'm going to say, because I'm going to develop an argument and I want to proceed with it. The question which I haven't heard answered is, why was it that a group of people in Number 10, and possibly the Prime Minister as well, felt that that level of pressure should be placed on the Foreign Office in favour of appointing Mandelson? And I think there are two possible answers, but let me focus on one. I think that the political unit in Number 10, and possibly the Prime Minister too, wanted Mandelson because he was their close political ally and because he was plugged into a vast international network of what we might call the billionaire class. The truth is that much of the nectar of wealth which Mandelson was plugging into, and so was the President, by the way, was centred around Epstein. And let me just pause in my narrative for a second. None of this debate, none of these facts would emerge were it not for the courage and bravery and resistance of the women who had been treated so appallingly on Epstein Island. But getting Mandelson into Washington as part of that network was the highest priority. A political network of highly reimbursed billionaires, frankly. All of this leaves a bad taste. The government had promised change to the people, but the change which they saw in the end was further to accelerate the integration of the British state and government into the networks of the richest people. But people in our country, certainly in my constituency, didn't vote for that. They wanted a change for their ordinary lives, a better NHS, cost of living improvements and so on and so forth. Well, we've got a long way to go to deliver that, but we did deliver a disaster with the appointment of Mandelson. I've raised the question of unemployment 4 times in recent months. Growing unemployment in our area. It's hard to see how the time which was spent by the government ingratiating ourselves to Washington would really help the unemployed and the poor. And just think about Mandelson's business involvement with Russia and China. So obnoxious is China supposed to be? I think I'm right in saying that this building has spanned all Chinese-based networks, as though these are the agencies of an enemy state. How could it be that Mandelson's links were seen to be of such a low risk? And when it comes to Russia, this House has spent literally hours discussing the appalling behaviour of Putin and Russia in relation to the east of Europe. All of these should have counted against Mandelson, but they were weighed in the balance and they counted less than the opportunity which Mandelson presumably offered as his access to a network of people, which included the President. So let me I want to be very quick. I've made a case. I'm going to just make one final point. Mandelson had played a key role in a faction which sought to change the strategic direction of our party, the Labour Party, and of the government. The truth is, they wanted to change the Labour Party into something it never was. I will do, but very briefly.
I thank the member for giving way. I thank the member for giving way, and he's making an excellent and very important speech. On the point about Labour Together, is he aware that most of the supporters, and indeed, as I understand it, the bankrollers of Labour Together, had nothing whatsoever to do with the traditions of the Labour movement? It was merely using a name in order to try and change the nature of the Labour Party away from its traditional socialist objectives.
Well, I have had a debate previously on Labour Together, so I'll leave the comments which my right friend has made to stand for themselves. This was a faction which sought to change the Labour Party in something it never was. And if we continue down the path which has been chosen, I fear that we are in a downward spiral from which we will not escape.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by reflecting on something I feel, I'm sure many members across the House feel, and what our constituents certainly feel, and that is how utterly depressing it is that we're having to have this debate at all. Just a few years after we went through all this under Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, and less than 2 years after the British people voted them out of office for indulging in this sort of chaos and distraction, here we are again. Vladimir Putin is waging war on our continent. Donald Trump is waging war with Iran. We desperately need to strengthen our own national defences. Families and businesses are struggling against the cost of living crisis. Petrol prices have soared, and people are really worried about what Trump's war will mean for their holidays this summer and their energy and food bills this winter. And our NHS is still in crisis. We all have constituents who are waiting weeks to see a GP, people who are dying on corridors in our hospitals, loved ones who aren't getting the care they need. We should be talking about them today. Theirs are the problem the government should be focused on every single day. This is what they promised after all. In their manifesto, they said that the problems in our country are, and I quote, a direct result of a governing party that time and again puts its own interests above the issues that affect families. They promised to change that, but here we are again. Instead of fixing the NHS and social care, instead of properly funding our defence, instead of cutting prices at the pump, here we are having to ask why the Prime Minister appointed the close friend of a notorious paedophile sex trafficker to one of the most important and sensitive jobs in this government. Peter Mandelson, whose relationship with Jeffrey Epstein had been well reported and highlighted to the Prime Minister, who had already been forced to resign in disgrace twice from the previous Labour governments, and who we now know was deemed a national security risk by the government's vetting agency. And so we do, sadly, have to ask, why did the Prime Minister do this? Why did he appoint Mandelson? Why did he announce the appointment before the national security had been done, despite the then Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, having told him that should happen first? And why was he so determined to get Mandelson in post that he created, as Olly Robbins described it this morning, an atmosphere of pressure and a certain dismissiveness about the developed vetting process. A vetting process the Prime Minister had since blamed for his mistakes. And even after all this, even after yesterday's statement, the Prime Minister still hasn't told us why he appointed Mandelson. He admitted that appointing Mandelson was a mistake, and he's apologised for it. He's tried to make the rest about process and officials. But he still hasn't answered the fundamental question, why? But I think we know a big part of the answer, don't we? Donald Trump. This all comes back to the way the Prime Minister decided to approach his relationship with the President when he came back to office last year. Our party urged the Prime Minister to stand up to Trump, to stand together with our allies, to approach him from a position of strength, not weakness. But he chose the opposite course. He decided to try and appease Trump, to flatter Trump, to stroke Trump's ego and hope he'd be nice to us in return. And clearly, he thought Peter Mandelson was the man for that job. So that is it. The decision to try and curry favour with Trump instead of standing up to him. That is the original sin that has landed the Prime Minister and his government in the mess they are in today. And has it worked? Absolutely not.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Yesterday I asked the Prime Minister about Peter Mandelson's security vetting condition and his visiting of previous clients, which required him to be accompanied when he visited previous clients. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we need to find out whether this lack of having accompaniment to visiting Palantir in Washington with the Prime Minister was a one-off, or simply Mandelson continuing business as usual?
Well, my honourable friend was right to ask that question yesterday, and I thought the Prime Minister's response to him was totally inadequate, that those types of meetings had not been recorded. But if I can go back to President Trump, Mr. Speaker, despite all the flattering, Trump has still caused enormous damage to our economy and to the livelihoods of the British people with his tariffs and his war with Iran. Trump still undermines NATO, makes threats against our country and our allies, and insults Britain's armed forces. And just look at what Trump said last night, that Mandelson was a really bad pick. Now, I won't dwell on the hypocrisy of Trump's words, from a man who was close friends with Epstein, who parted with him, and has so far taken no responsibility for that. From a president who still has, as his Commerce Secretary, a neighbour of Epstein, who visited Epstein's island and who lied about his relationship with him. All that is for another debate. But Trump's post, Mr. Speaker, hypocritical as it is, does show the futility of trying to appease him. It shows how pointless it is to make a decision, like who to appoint as US ambassador, based on what Trump would like most. It doesn't work, it hasn't worked. And I hope that on top of everything else, the Prime Minister and the party opposite will reflect on that point. The approach to Trump has failed. It is time to change course and stand up to him. Stand with our European and Commonwealth allies in defence of our national interest. Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a mess of the government's own making. A mess born out of a futile attempt to appease Donald Trump. And a mess that just keeps getting worse with today's revelations, uncovered by my honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, that the Prime Minister pushed for the appointment as ambassador of another Labour crony with ties to a sex offender. Catastrophically bad judgments that have created a mess that has distracted and consumed this government and stopped it from focusing on what the British people actually need. Because the people out there don't want more Westminster drama. They're thinking about the hospital appointment that keeps getting pushed back, the mortgage payments that just seem to keep going up, the loved ones who need care but is stuck on a waiting list, the threats to our national security from an ever more dangerous world. Those are the things that keep people up at night, and they deserve a Prime Minister and a government that is focused on them. Our party will never stop making that case. We will never stop holding this government to account, not for the sake of political point scoring, but on behalf of the British people who deserve better than this. Mr. Speaker, the last Conservative government failed our country by getting stuck in a cycle of chaos and scandal and refusing to move on. The question for the Labour Party is whether they will repeat that mistake or finally deliver the change our country needs.
Yeah. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton. And the point he was making latterly really about the economy and the situation we find ourselves in. I would say the Prime Minister is absolutely focused on that and has been from day one. There are these distractions and it would be great to move on from them, but of course we are entitled to this debate. But I do believe that he wanted to bring order to our trade arrangements, and that was why he was persuaded into appointing Peter Mandelson. And I am not a big fan of Peter Mandelson. I can assure you of that. But what I would say is, just a short year ago, many people in this House were fating him and around the world for the deal that Mandelson managed to strike with the United States. Now, there are many questions about that deal that was struck by Peter Mandelson. But for the purposes of this debate, I just want to come back to some of the points that the Leader of the Opposition made. And I didn't intervene on her because I felt it was absolutely fine for her to continue. But just to pick up on some of the points that she made yesterday, because she amply demonstrated that she was very capable of not prosecuting an argument. She emphasised about process. And there is one thing I would say about this Prime Minister, is that he is absolutely rock solid when it comes to process. You may laugh, but for those of you in this place, those members, Mr. Speaker, who backed Boris Johnson, who accepted his lies in this place, or accepted the word of Liz Truss and that catastrophic kamikaze budget. That would be the question of judgment. On process, this Prime Minister is absolutely rock solid. And a second point I would make about him, Mr. Speaker, is he is a man of utmost decency and would never, ever lie, because he knows that his credibility rests on that. There is a point, I will come in a moment, I am just beginning to make my speech. There is a point here about some sort of conspiracy, some sort of cover-up that is being. And when the Leader of the Opposition speaks of number 10, I think she may be, if I could disabuse of her, the point is between the Prime Minister and the team around him.
Will you give away at that point?
And the point is, I will come, there's others I want to allow in. The point is to differentiate between the team around him and the Prime Minister himself. The Prime Minister clearly delegated responsibilities to his Chief of Staff. Now, it may be the case that the Leader of Opposition missed the fact that the Prime Minister sacked that.
Bernard, please, you're in my visual, be permanently stood up. He can give way when he wants to, not because you're stood up, obviously. Not Weston.
I will bring in the Right Honourable Gentleman shortly, just to ease your patience, Mr. Speaker. But the point being that when he sacked Morgan McSweeney, he realised that there were problems within his team at number 10. Now, she may claim that somehow number 10 was the leadership, or number 10 was the worst in living memory. Now, the living memory, I'm not sure how far back that goes for her, but as my honourable friend for Normanton and Hemsworth was saying, that we don't have to go back very far, I would say, to 2022 with a certain Liz Truss and her number 10 operation, or that of Boris Johnson and the 3 years we endured of his lying, his pathological lying in this place. But look, the Leader of the Opposition, and I will come to him in just a moment, the Leader of the Opposition was talking about the biggest decision that a Prime Minister can make is about the security of this country. Just a few short weeks ago, she was talking about that the United Kingdom should be drawn into the war in Iran, and it was proven absolutely wrong. I will allow my right honourable friend to come in.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable gentleman, who I know as a friend across this House, and we work together positively on many things. But as I served on the Privileges Committee that studied the Boris case and reached a conclusion upon it, if he wants to help the Prime Minister, I would be rather wary of making parallels between Boris Johnson and the present Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend. I mean, the point I was making was simply to address that from the Leader of the Opposition, who was suggesting the operation at Number 10 was the worst in living memory. I think it's quite obvious that that is absolutely not the case. We have just had two very recent examples in 19 to 22 and then in 22-23 under Johnson and Truss. I want to make it quite clear that the way I see the mistake that may have been made by Number 10 is the clear delegation, a clear delegation to his Chief of Staff. And that Chief of Staff was at the heart of what I would say is an inner circle within Number 10, which no longer exists, of Peter Mandelson, of Morgan McSweeney and Matthew Doyle. And as has come to light just this morning, that Matthew Doyle was also part of that problem.
Honourable gentleman for giving way, and there must be a reshuffle coming, Mr. Speaker, because no one would seriously make a speech like this at such serious times. He says the Prime Minister was a stickler for process, and he has claimed that the Prime Minister has somehow delegated responsibility for the appointment. Therefore, can I ask him, with the box note from the Cabinet Secretary, the Chief Advisor to the Prime Minister and Chief Civil Servant, why he advised, and can the honourable gentleman defend the Prime Minister's decision not to follow that advice if he was making the decisions?
Look, I am not very close to these operations. I've never been a minister, but that is the honest truth. I have never been a minister, and to answer his point, I do not wish to be a minister either. But I am not close enough to that, so I cannot answer that honestly. But what I can say is what I heard from Sir Olly Robbins this morning about how he was lent on, and also what documents he may have had access to, and also the vetting report. But look, what I would say, what we've heard today, is that the Chief of Staff lent on the Foreign Office, whether it was on Matthew Doyle or whether it was the appointment of Peter Mandelson. And that is the issue. What I would say is the Prime Minister, in my experience of having known him since 2017, is that he is absolutely straight as a die. He may have accepted the advice, and maybe that advice has now proven to be wrong. But, you know, he's been let down by those around him. He made a mistake. He understands that, and he's accepted that.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. And the court case goes quiet. Those are the immortal words in the famous film, A Few Good Men. That's the realisation in that court case that things have moved from process to accountability and responsibility. If you haven't seen the film, it's about two Marines who are on trial for killing another. But the real story that unravels is whether command can deny any responsibility of the actions that it set in motion. Here lies the parallel. When subordinates act on the understood direction of authority, where does responsibility ultimately sit? They acted because of you. It belongs to you. Let's recount the facts that we do, though, that aren't disputed.
in this House. Lord Mandelson was announced as the Prime Minister to be the US ambassador from the UK in December 24. UK security vetting recommended against developed vetting clearance in January 2025. The FCDO overruled that recommendation, enabling the appointment, and the Prime Minister stated publicly due process had been followed. Sir Olly Robbins, then Permanent Secretary, was later dismissed. But what Robbins told us in the committee in November 2025 is telling. Quote, "By the time we are describing, it was clear the Prime Minister wanted to make his appointment himself. Therefore, I understand the FCDO was informed of his decision, acted on it, and via the Foreign Secretary sought and obtained the King's approval for the appointment. In this case, as Chris explained, the Prime Minister took advice and formed a view himself, and we then acted on that view." The FCDO is clear. This wasn't drift. It was acting under direction. The Prime Minister formed that view. They acted on it. Acting on instruction, acting on direction, acting on what the Prime Minister wanted. Yet, since then, the Prime Minister's been trying to separate the decision and the consequence. There's the decision, there are the consequences, but we and this public know you can't separate the two. If an official acts in the shadow of a settled view, responsibility returns to that source where the shadow was first cast. And let's draw some more comparisons in the film, because it's quite telling. Colonel Jessup does not issue the written order. Prime Minister does not personally do the vetting. Subordinates act on a clear command and intent. The FCDO acted on the political intent. The defence by the Colonel was, "I didn't order that." The defence by the Prime Minister was, "I wasn't told." The court finds, though, that authority can't be passive. We in this House say neither can the Prime Minister be. The blame lands on the subordinates, and the same again has happened here. In both cases, the controversy is not on the mechanics, but where the moral and constitutional responsibility resides. Officials were acting on a settled prime ministerial preference. The Prime Minister can't have it both ways. He can't have decisive authority on the way in and plausible deniability on the way out. That's not process, that's power without accountability. If the decision was his, isn't the responsibility his? And if not, why not? And whose is it then? I will give way.
I think this is probably a useful speech to intervene on due to my striking resemblance to Tom Cruise. But the key point in that scenario was about responsibility. And I think members opposite are probably lucky that Sadiq Khan has cancelled all the tubes today, otherwise there may be another transport mechanism they may be under. But does this not show wider that the Prime Minister is failing in his key role, which is to take responsibility for the decisions he's charged to take?
He's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, and the bottom line, it really is here. The Prime Minister has shaped the system by having a settled political decision, one that's had horrific consequences, despite all the warnings that we've talked about in this House about Mandelson being fired twice and etc. And is now trying to point to the process as the failings, but the country isn't buying it. The film teaches us this simple lesson: power cannot hide behind those who obey it. And just before I finish, I have a message for the Labour MPs and would like to address them directly. And to paraphrase directly from that famous speech from Colonel Jessup, he says, "The PM neither has the time nor inclination to explain himself to backbenchers who rise and sleep under the blanket of the very majority that he provides, and then questions the manner in which the PM provides it. The PM would rather you say just thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, he suggests you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, he doesn't give a damn about what you're entitled to."
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Following the revelations at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee today by Oliver Robbins, who said how the Prime Minister had pushed for Peter Mandelson to be appointed, and also was pushing for his former Director of Communications, Matthew Doyle, to be appointed as well, unqualified for the post. Would my honourable friend agree? These are not the actions of a Prime Minister concerned about the national interest, rather his personal interest. Nor is it the actions of Prime Minister concerned about national security, merely his job security, particularly pushing for Peter Mandelson, who is a known national security risk.
The member's very senior makes an absolute erudite point. The question is, we still don't know why the Prime Minister chose Mandelson. He's never said exactly the reasons why he did. We can all see the reasons why he shouldn't have done. But I will table.
Can I just ask my honourable friend that there surely can be no situation that he thinks where officials do not flag concerns with ministers or prime ministers, because fundamentally it is them that are accountable to this House and the British public, and what we are talking about is accountability here.
Accountability starts from the top. Absolutely. We've heard in the FCDO today, the message from number 10 was, get this effing done. That was the political directive, and everything else follows suit. And that's exactly what Olly Robbins has said. And here is where I conclude, Mr. Speaker, because this side of the House knows the truth. The public want the truth. The only question that remains is, can the Labour benchers, the backbenchers, handle the truth? Because surely if they can't, they must do something about it.
Just help the House with how many people got an informal time limit, 7 minutes, and a good example to set that record is Caroline Harris.
I will be very, very brief, as I'm not attempting to audition for a BAFTA, unlike some of my colleagues. And neither am I trying to attempt any factional point scoring, as some colleagues have stated today. The Prime Minister himself said yesterday Peter Mandelson should never have been appointed as our ambassador to the US. So I'm going to be very simple on this one, so can the Chief Secretary tell the House how the Prime Minister has changed the way due diligence and security vetting is conducted before appointments are announced in the future? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our ambassador in Washington stands at the nexus of the Five Eyes, with more classified intelligence crossing his desk than cross the desks of most cabinet ministers. It's obviously one of the most important appointments the Prime Minister makes, but it's also one of the most sensitive. A security failure in the post could seriously jeopardise the Five Eyes relationship. The Americans are notoriously twitchy about security. So the appointee's conduct before the appointment must be beyond reproach, and their trustworthiness must be impeccable. Now we had one of our best ambassadors, Karen Pierce, was already in place. She was highly regarded by the State Department and the White House, and contrary to what the Lib Dem leader said, so much so that President Trump called the Prime Minister, urged him to keep Pierce, while expressing concern about Mandelson. One of 3 calls from the White House on her behalf and against him. She was a high-class, high-performance, zero-risk choice. Against that, we had the London establishment view that somehow Mandelson's amoral dark arts would make him a good ambassador, typically espoused by people with no idea what makes a good ambassador. One of the questions before us in assessing the Prime Minister's judgment is whether Mandelson was a better appointment than Karen Pierce, and if so, was the benefit of that appointment sufficient to outweigh the clear risks of that appointment? And of course the answer to both of those questions is an emphatic no. It was abundantly clear to anyone taking a decision that he was a significant security risk. A man who'd twice been forced to resign from government, with known links to a paedophile, closely associated with Russian oligarch Deripaska, a man who'd been responsible for the deaths of 100 people, personally responsible for murders and extortion, and with whom Mr Mandelson, or Lord Mandelson as he was then, spent weekends in his Dhaka and in Moscow. Weekends, of course, because the EU doesn't record where you are the weekend as a commissioner. That's the sort of background we're talking about. And as we heard from my right honourable friend, the leader of my party, he was also a non-executive director of Starmer, a Russian arms dealing company led by a Putin ally. And Mandelson's role at Starmer, when he stood down, he then took a large shareholding, which he kept for some time as well. All of this is in the public domain. It was in the public domain before he was appointed. China too, I can list them over and over again. TikTok, owned by the Chinese state. Shine, based on Uyghur forced labour. And of course, he always calls time and time again for, at the time, he called it time and time again for closer Anglo-Chinese relationships. Now, when you make appointments like this, it's not an appointment and not a judgment beyond reasonable doubt. It's not even a judgment on the balance of probabilities. It's a judgment on significant risk. Are you going to take a significant risk with a Five Eyes relationship? Of course you're not. And it should be clear on public data alone that this man is a significant, or was a significant risk. And indeed, the proprieties and ethics team in the Cabinet Office flagged most of the issues I've just described to number 10 before this process started. And we should remember, and Mr. Speaker, forgive me for being so direct, but Peter Mandelson is a man who has proven he's greedy for money, greedy for glamour, greedy for status, greedy for power, and willing to break the rules to get them. That's the key point, willing to break the rules to get them. Such a man is a classic security risk in the face of Russian or Chinese compromise. That's not to mention the risk posed by, of course, his known involvement with Epstein. Number 10 chose... I'll give way very quickly, yes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank him for giving way. I have to say, I'm not in the Peter Mandelson fan club. I'm old enough to remember his first life in this government. But this morning we heard that the UK VS judged them to be a borderline risk, and we heard how officials thought that that risk could be managed. This is quite different from what you're outlining, of what the honourable gentleman's outlining.
Is the public information. If he wants to get into the argument on UKVS between UKVS, who we're now told was a marginal, and number 10, who says it's a red, the strike-off, he can argue between them. I'm talking about public data. What you should know before you start this process. And number 10, no, he's had his go. Sit down. Number 10 has chosen to ignore these things. And that's critical. Because we've heard already about the pressure put on the Foreign Office over and over again. And forgive me again, Mr Speaker, but for the direct quote, because it's obscene, but the chairman actually recounted how Morgan McSweeney called Sir Olly's predecessor and told him, quotes, just fucking approve it. Now, speaking to the committee, he made clear he was under constant pressure and there was an atmosphere of constant chasing. Why? Well, we already know it's not because Mandelson was a materially better candidate than Karen Pierce, the brilliant, well-established, highly regarded incumbent with excellent connections to the White House. It was because Mandelson was a leading member of the new Labour aristocracy. Full stop. Not talent, connection. It wasn't even, it was not in the national interest, plainly, it wasn't even in the Labour interest. It was in the interest of a Labour clique. Now, Mandelson's appointment was a decision in complete disregard of the risks, known risks, which explains the Prime Minister's lack of curiosity about the vetting. It wasn't lack of curiosity. He did not ask because he did not want to know. The former Cabinet Secretary warned the Prime Minister he should secure Mandelson's security clearance before the appointment. He was warned on the 11th of December by the Cabinet Office about his past, his public past. And on the 11th of September last year, number 10 was asked by a journalist whether Mandelson had failed to develop vetting. Number 10 knew. It's as plain as a pikestone. So, where do we go from here? We have a Prime Minister and a government in power who are making decisions in the interests of their own clique within their own party. And they're making their interests at the explicit risk of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister should resign.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Peter Mandelson once spoke of the Labour left being sealed in a tomb. Today, it is the toxic politics he came to represent that should be buried. Politics that repels millions and drifts far from the values on which our party was founded. If we are serious about renewal, serious about learning the lessons of this troubling episode, then we must confront that culture, what enabled it. That means looking at figures such as the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, a protege of Mandelson's, and of the network of influence around him. Mandelson's appointment did not happen in isolation, as we learn today. It reflects a wider direction under the Prime Minister, where those behind the Labour Together project wielded significant influence in developing this toxic culture, which has been allowed to take hold of number 10 in the governing of our country. It points to a political culture that lacks candour, exists to promote wealth and power, and ignores all else in pursuit of this. It's a culture where proximity to power outweighs principle, where access counts far more than accountability, and where the suffering of victims is overshadowed by connections. When decisions are driven by patronage and power is concentrated in a narrow circle, it is not only our internal party democracy that suffers, but the integrity of our public institutions and our country. And too often, it is our civil servants, those who serve with professionalism and integrity, who are left to carry the consequences. I want to commend Sir Olly Robbins for giving evidence today. His professionalism and dedication after a week where he has been very publicly hounded by some in government was commendable. And it was good to see his trade union backing him steadfastly at the committee today. Robbins will be a loss to the FCDO and the country, all brought about by a series of catastrophic political decisions by number 10. That is not right, not fair, and it's not what the public expects of elected officials. And because of this, the public will rightly demand accountability and cultural change. This must begin with a thorough review of the political operation which brought the Prime Minister to power and which clearly continues to carry undue influence over this government. So I once again, as I have asked on multiple occasions, now in both letters to the Prime Minister and speeches in this place, call for a full, transparent and independent investigation into the activities and practices of Labour Together, both prior to and after the election of this government. Only then will we fully understand how this exclusive political network has been able to undermine our democracy and institutions right at the heart of government.
Speaker, like many, I spent the weekend door-knocking in my constituency. People in Bicester and Woodstock are frustrated by delays to medical appointments, fed up with rising prices and fearful about the war in the Middle East. Yet a number of them raised the Prime Minister's handling of the Peter Mandelson saga. Their overwhelming emotion was disappointment that a Prime Minister who promised change has delivered so little, and anger that a Prime Minister who said he would be better than the Tories had failed so badly. The Prime Minister set out yesterday to defend himself. Mr. Speaker, he set out that case like a barrister. He took the narrow view that the charge was misleading the House, and he tried to claim that Sir Olly Robbins had repeatedly misled him, and so it was only natural that he should have misled us. He failed first by misjudging the seriousness of his failure. It was as though he was charged with petty larceny when the actual offence was gross misconduct decapitation. Yet the crucial weakness in his argument was one of chronology. He cited statements and reports between September 2025 and April 2026, but the crime he sought to defend was committed between December 2024 and January 2025. He had no answer to why he ignored the advice of the Cabinet Secretary to seek security clearance before appointing Mandelson. He could not explain why he announced Mandelson's appointment without conditions, nor why the offer letter to Mandelson, dated before Sir Olly started work, said that Mandelson had cleared security clearance. Mr. Speaker, the damning evidence given today by Sir Olly Robbins confirms what the Prime Minister failed to dispel yesterday. There was a complacent culture in Downing Street, indeed there may still be, which had a dismissive approach to vetting Lord Mandelson. The Prime Minister wants us now to believe he would have sacked Mandelson if he had failed vetting. Yet all the evidence then is that he and his team did not care about vetting and even believed it had already been granted. We further learnt this morning that officials in Number 10 asked the FCDO to find an ambassadorial role for Matthew Doyle, another man who was friends with a convicted sex offender. What is worse, they told FCDO officials not to tell the Foreign Secretary. The unavoidable conclusion is that under the Prime Minister and Morgan McSweeney, Number 10 believed it could fix plum jobs for the boys, and they were all boys, Mr. Speaker, with casual disregard for process, propriety or national security. So we come to the consequences of this sorry episode. First, a distinguished civil servant has lost his position as the fall guy for the Prime Minister. I was proud to work with Sir Olly, and I know the regard held for him by ministers and civil servants. So I am frankly furious, to use a word of the day, to learn that a Number 10 spokesman has just said that Sir Olly was, and I quote, a man of integrity and professionalism who made an error of judgment. Mr. Speaker, it is extraordinary that when political appointees like Peter Mandelson or the former Deputy Prime Minister are accused of errors of judgment or worse, the Prime Minister has come to that dispatch box and defended them for days. Yet when the Prime Minister's error of judgment was highlighted again, he took a few short hours to dismiss Sir Olly. In the last 5 days, the Prime Minister has gone further and directed the full power of the state against one man. The Government Legal Service reinterpreted the Cragg Act on Sunday. The Government Communication Service briefed hard against Robbins. And Cabinet Office officials sought to prime the Foreign Affairs Committee before it heard from Sir Olly today. This state-led assault on one man is unprecedented and it is unacceptable. If the point of committing an error of judgment is to resign, why is the Prime Minister still in post? Second, this whole episode has done grave damage to relations between ministers and civil servants. The Prime Minister once said, and I quote, "When staff make mistakes, I carry the can. I never turn on my staff." No one believes that now. His cowardly reaction has shown civil servants that they should be fearful of future treatment by the Prime Minister, Number 10 and ministers. As a former Permanent Secretary, I believed that the Prime Minister understood and valued the relationship between trust, candour and loyalty that governs the best relationship in ministries. Today, those relationships are shattered and our country will be the poorer for it. And so thirdly, Mr. Speaker, my constituents and people up and down the country worried about waiting lists, rising prices and threats to security can have no confidence that this Prime Minister can change our country for the better. When something went wrong in government, the Prime Minister did not take responsibility, he took the easy way out. When called on to defend himself, he failed abjectly. This sorry tale points to a corrupted culture at the heart of Number 10, and there is now only one man left to carry the can. He must complete the clear-out and resign.
Alice Badge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I came this morning from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee where we had the opportunity to speak to Sir Olly Robbins as our witness. So I wanted to use this debate to pull out some of the pertinent points that we heard there, which I think are relevant. But before I start, I absolutely agree with members across the House that are saying that Lord Mandelson was a completely inappropriate and terrible choice for our ambassador. And there has clearly been a failure in the process that ended up with his appointment and vetting. But it's important that we look at what Sir Olly said in the witness statement today, because some of that contradicts what has been said through some of the statements in the House. The first thing that Sir Olly said, which I think was important, is that he said to the committee this morning that no ministers, not the Prime Minister, not the Foreign Secretary, nor any other minister or official in Number 10 was given any sight that UKSV had declined Mandelson's security vetting. They had no sight at all of any details of that vetting. And he said that and he justified that and he defended that because no officials and no ministers should have sight of that vetting, because it is extremely personal and sensitive information. I mean, I'm someone that's gone through that process myself when I was working at the Foreign Office. What you do not want to create is any sort of conditions where people are afraid of sharing sensitive information in a vetting process that some period in the future might be leaked, and whether that's to politicians, whether that's to other people in your line management chain, or as we've seen later on, it's been leaked to the press, because that undermines the integrity of the process as a whole. So I think that, firstly, that reinforces what the Prime Minister said yesterday. The second thing he said, Sir Olly, was he disputed the characterisation that UKSV had failed that Peter Mandelson's vetting, that it was some way a binary choice inside the Foreign Office. It's important that we explain, or I try and justify what Sir Olly was saying, because the FCDO, they do have a slightly different process to other parts of government, and that is because, as an overseas department, a bit like the MOD and other places, there are people that come into those roles with seriously long careers and all sorts of different interests. And I'm not suggesting that Peter Mandelson should have passed the vetting, not at all. But the fact that a borderline case was coming to FCDO and the FCDO was making that decision rather than UKSV was not unusual. That was quite a normal process to happen, according to Sir Olly's evidence. And it's the sort of thing that is important that we hold in the future. And I think it's important for us to say that as well. And thirdly, I think that is really important is not only did... Please, I'll give way.
I'm really surprised that he's swallowing this guff about it being a borderline case. It was quite clear that security vetting put this in the red box, which meant fail. Sir Olly is being lauded to the skies now because he's the victim of ruthless prime ministerial politics. But he also has an angle on this, and the angle is that he, shall we say, massaged his own judgment because he knew the pressure that was on him from the government. There was nothing borderline about this. The only reason he's saying it was borderline was because he needs an excuse for having overridden it when he shouldn't have done.
Yes. Please speak to what the witness told us in the inquiry this morning, and he was very clear, and many members made the same case that you're making now. That it was a red box, as we've seen in that evidence that was submitted. But he was very clear that it was borderline. This was very usual for the Foreign Office to conduct these types of cases. And I think you can make your own mind about whether you believe him or believe other people. Please.
What he actually said, I came in to watch, what he actually said was the advice he was given by his Director of Intelligence, I think, was borderline. One of the issues which were not clear was that whether the pressure from number 10 was simply on him or on all members of the channel, if you like, down to lower levels.
Yes, I had a different interpretation. So Sir Olly also said, and you can look back at the transcript, that yes, there was pressure from number 10 to get the appointment done quickly. It could be interpreted that they wanted to get that appointment done before the inauguration of President Trump. There was an important timeline that needed to be done by, because there was a risk that any new ambassadorial appointments after that might be interfered. Again, this was the words of Sir Olly. I'm not bringing this up from nowhere. And let me finish. The other important point: it wasn't just the UK security vetting system that put a borderline process through, and then the FCDO approved it. It was also the intelligence agencies. So I think it's equally concerning that Peter Mandelson was given strap clearance. And I asked Sir Olly directly, were there any concerns raised by the intelligence agencies on the process of obtaining strap clearance, which is a higher level of security, which allows him to have access to the highest, most classified secrets that the country has. And there was no one from the intelligence agencies that raised any concerns during that strap process either. So I think these are serious concerns in the process. Yes,
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I gently say to him and to others who seek to make this argument he's pursuing, at the heart of this is a toxic and dismissive culture at number 10. That's a point we can not get away from. That dismissiveness has led us to this place. This is not a small administration breach, it's a matter of national security. The British public is not buying it. Surely we should be saying there needs to be a full, transparent, independent inquiry into this whole situation to uncover the truth. That's what the British public want, with consequences for including the Prime Minister.
That is not my experience of Number 10, and I am pleased to see that there is a review looking at the vetting system, because I think there are serious problems with the vetting system that this process has uncovered. Indeed, I mean, my takeaways from the evidence that I heard this morning are a number of them. I agree with members that Peter Mandelson was a terrible pick for our ambassador. Even without knowing the things that came out later, I think it was the wrong decision that he should have been picked. But also, there has clearly been failures in the vetting process, both with the DV vetting, both with the process of the FCDO and with the process of the STRAP vetting. So I'm pleased that the government has announced 2 reviews, one to be led by Sir Adrian Fulford and a separate Cabinet Office review to look at those vetting processes and ensure that both for Peter Mandelson's vetting and for the UK vetting system more generally, that such mistakes do not happen again. I'm slightly concerned that in the short term, the government has suspended the ability of overseas departments to operate their discretion in granting developed vetting. I know that that's a sensible response in the short term, but I hope as the reviews go through that the Minister will consider the reasons why these departments have that discretion in the future.
I thank him for giving way, and I'm very grateful for him to do so, and I've listened quite carefully to his speech. Given what he heard at the committee this morning and his background experience, does he regret Olly Robbins' sacking?
I feel very sympathetic to Olly Robbins. Olly Robbins will have an opportunity to account for Sir Olly Robbins, will have an opportunity to account for himself, but he gave a very good account of himself at the committee this morning, and it's not for me to make that judgment. I can think of several good reasons why the FCDO and the MOD might need to use that discretion in the future. I'm also really concerned that details about Peter Mandelson's vetting were leaked to the press in September. Even considering Peter Mandelson's misconduct, the integrity of that process is really important, and Sir Olly also raised concerns about this issue. So I hope that the reviews that the Minister announced the other day will also look at the leaks to the press, because it is really unacceptable that such vital personal information about the vetting process has been released in that way. But most importantly, I think Sir Olly's evidence, it rubbishes some of the accusations that members yesterday were making in the House and indeed in the media, that were questioning the Prime Minister's honesty about the situation, because he did categorically rule out any suggestion that the Prime Minister knew anything about that, for good reason. So I think those members that made those accusations and that were rightly thrown out of the House, they should come forward and correct the record and apologise on that point. I will take one more intervention and then I'll finish up.
But does he surely realise that to those of us...
Did say 7 minutes, I think you know, on 10. Don't worry, Liz Savile-Roberts.
Does he surely raise to people outside that this argument, these fine details over process, it morphs into a defence of ignorance, and then it morphs into a defence of incompetency, and that actually is doing the Prime Minister as much harm as all these arguments about his honesty?
So I think we've heard real concerns about the process here, and I'm glad that the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister has announced reviews into that process, because we really need to make sure we get it right in the future. Thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this is a particularly sorry saga, and this is corrosive not just for certainly this government and the Labour Party. It's corrosive for the entire political class and politicians as a collective body, and it is certainly corrosive for the country. And that's because there is a particular theme that's emerged from this and from other episodes under this government around competency, or what the public would probably look at as a general theme of incompetency, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've got this situation here where it's frankly ludicrous and laughable that we've got to this point, that Peter Mandelson, a man who has, for the best part of 2 decades, his name has been synonymous. It's been a byword for sleaze and incompetence. That's before we knew about the risks that he posed or could continue to pose if he were given a position to our national security. And the corrosiveness of this and the corrosiveness of this government and the question of incompetency is borne out through all of the decisions that we've seen that the government has U-turned over. I think we're up to around 18 in 2 years. We've seen the corrosive effects of government policy across the board, whether it's on the economy, whether it's the price that business are paying as a result of questions that the government haven't asked. And that begs the question around the Prime Minister's general incuriosity around seemingly everything, least of all this, the most serious of issues. Now, Peter Mandelson was known to be a paedophile-adjacent character at the time that the Prime Minister took this decision, seemingly at any cost, to appoint him as ambassador to the United States. And I think so many in this House have alluded to it, that it seems that that happened because he was seen as a particularly slick operator at the top of the Labour Party, and he was seemingly untouchable to so many. And it's a great shame it's got to this point, this sort of ongoing debacle and scandal, the evasion from the Prime Minister, to have sort of, caused the downfall of Peter Mandelson. But there are unanswered questions remaining, Mr. Speaker, including a really simple one that has been asked many times. We haven't had an answer to this, but I would love to know, my constituents would love to know, many in this House would love to know, what were the seemingly virtuous qualities of Peter Mandelson that did warrant the on-balance risk, on-balance very serious risk that the government took in pursuing his appointment. The pressure placed on the Foreign Office into clearing and appointing Mandelson has become apparent over the last few weeks, and particularly this morning following the testimony of Olly Robbins. And it's frankly reprehensible, Mr. Speaker. We've heard that Olly Robbins was told, to get this done at any cost, to ride effectively roughshod over good moral conduct to deliver the will of the Prime Minister. And we're starting to hear sort of glimmers that certain people at the top of government, perhaps those in the Cabinet, had advised the Prime Minister or the Cabinet Office that they weren't comfortable with this. But the Prime Minister was just completely ignorant of this, Mr. Speaker, throughout the whole process. And we now know that Peter Mandelson was effectively appointed and given access to very sensitive security information before his security clearance was granted. So a direct question for the Minister, can the Minister tell the House whether he is aware that Peter Mandelson had access to sensitive information prior to the security clearance recommendation coming through? If the Minister is not aware of that, what review is being put in place to ascertain the level of that information, and what risk management will be put in place to mitigate the effects of the exposure of any sensitive information that Peter Mandelson may have obtained during that period before the security clearance came through. And then, Mr. Speaker, there's another question around accountability. And many of us in this House, but particularly the country at large, would love to know, why is the bar of personal accountability so low for everyone else, yet impossibly high for the Prime Minister himself? Now, if I'd had the chance yesterday, and lots of members wanted to speak, and I understand why I did not get an opportunity, but I would have loved to have asked the Prime Minister, at any point, had he considered resigning? And if not, why not? And how many more have to be blamed or scapegoated before this becomes a situation where the Prime Minister does the decent thing and resigns? How many more twists and turns does this saga have to follow, Mr. Speaker, before the Prime Minister does the right thing? Because I can tell the Minister, who is looking somewhat uncomfortable, and I commend him for coming to the front bench today, I can tell him on behalf of my constituents they are sick and tired of the evasiveness of this Prime Minister. They want him to do the decent thing and to resign.
Speaker, I want to address 3 aspects in my remarks. Firstly, the appointment of Peter Mandelson in the first instance. Secondly, the approach taken by the Prime Minister as details have emerged over the last few months. And finally, the vetting process overall. But first, just to reflect on the debate so far, I mean, it's been characterised by a collective amnesia on those benches, some amateur dramatic theatrics we've seen. We've seen the Right Honourable Leader of the Liberal Democrats demonstrate why he's such a risk to trade and industry with one of our largest partners, trading partners. We've seen a member who sits over there choosing to lecture this side about the traditions in the Labour Party. And we've even seen some of my right honourable friends who I suspect their experience of number 10 has been purely in attacking number 10 and in a disciplinary capacity, lecturing us about claiming to have real insight into the culture in number 10. So at the core of the current debate is the decision to appoint Peter Mandelson as UK's ambassador to the USA. Clearly, Peter Mandelson's background of resigning twice from the ministerial office has been in the public record. And whilst there are other allegations about his conduct, not all of them were in the public domain at that time. And many recent revelations have led to his further dismissal from the ambassadorial post, action in relation to his peerage, referral to the police, and ongoing process there. It's clear to all that Peter Mandelson should never have been appointed to this role. And whilst this is the case, the apology offered by the Prime Minister on repeated occasions in this House and outside has been full, wholesome and without equivocation. And most importantly, the Prime Minister has repeatedly and rightly apologised to the victim of Jeffrey Epstein for making this appointment in the first instance. So whilst the initial appointment has, and I suspect will continue to be a matter of debate, the Prime Minister's apology cannot be faulted. I want to, in a bit, I want to address the wider approach taken by the Prime Minister in this case and other allegations against senior figures in this administration. And I think this is relevant. I'll come back to you in a second. I'll take you in a minute. It's the case that this Prime Minister promised a change in approach to dealing with such matters, an approach that embraces transparency, that is robust and that is timely, is essential in maintaining public trust and confidence in the government, in politicians and in this House.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he knows full well, this is not any personal vendetta against number 10. He, of all people, knows the culture that exists in number 10 and the toxicity of that culture. The question I want to ask him, and I say this in all sincerity, does he really expect the British public to buy what he's saying?
I think I have a better understanding of the culture in number 10 than you do, and I absolutely expect that the British public understand that the apology put forward by the Prime Minister has been full, it's been wholesome, it's been unequivocal, and that he hasn't messed about on that. If you come back to me, I'll take in a few minutes. And so maintaining. So dealing with allegations in a timely fashion, in a manner that is robust that ensures full transparency, is essential to maintaining trust and confidence in the government, in politicians and in this House. And on every occasion there has been an allegation levelled, the approach of this Prime Minister and this government, and whether it's been in Peter Mandelson, whether it's been in relation to previous Deputy Prime Minister, is the approach of this Prime Minister government has been in marked contrast to the previous successive Tory Prime Ministers. We saw then a real refusal to accept allegations were valid. We saw a refusal to address allegations in a timely fashion by referring for investigation, of investigations being dragged out, and a refusal to accept the findings of investigations. In the case of Peter Mandelson, it can be seen that the allegation and information, as the allegation information has been forthcoming, the Prime Minister has come to the dispatch box again and again, and he has sacked him, he's taken action again and again. And that action has been robust, speedy, and the ongoing commitment to the humble address will ensure full transparency in this. And this is in marked contrast to how the previous government has handled such matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman is talking about the point of full transparency, and it is in the ministerial code that ministers must be open and transparent. When the Prime Minister came to this House in February and said that the reason he'd sacked Mandelson was because he'd lied to him about his relationship with Epstein, do you think that was a full and transparent account of the reasons why Mandelson should not have had the job?
The Prime Minister set out why the information he presented to this House at the different times based on the information he had at the time. And I think further questions to that should be directed to the Prime Minister. But I think fundamentally though, this side will not take any lessons from that side who over a number of years presided over trampling trust and confidence in politicians and in this House into the ground again and again and again. So whilst I suspect this House has not seen the last of Peter Mandelson issue, I am hopeful that the change in approach towards allegations by this Prime Minister and this Government of transparency, timeliness and robust action is one that will continue in the future, and there's a lesson there for all of us. The final point I want to address is the vetting process. I believe strongly that the vetting process followed by government and departments should be robust, should have the confidence of those subject to vetting, as well as the government departments employing them, their colleagues and the wider public. And clearly to maintain that confidence requires a high degree of anonymity and confidence in that process. It's also the case that any information thrown up as part of that vetting process is acted on appropriately by government or by departments in a timely fashion. But there's a fundamental dilemma in expecting the government, or the Prime Minister in this case, to act on information that was never made available to government or ministers. And that's the fundamental issue here. So we need to ensure that the vetting system is fit for purpose, and a balance between confidentiality on the one hand and response at the appropriate level is essential. Clearly the current balance is not correct, and I welcome the steps being taken by the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister in this regard. I'll end by saying that this whole episode has exposed issues of judgment and process, and I suspect the debate will continue long in relation to both. But there is much to commend the judgment and approach taken by the administration in relation to information as information became available. And whatever the merits of the case, or whatever people feel about what's being discussed, some of those approaches in relation to transparency, timeliness and robust action is something I hope will continue.
So John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning's Foreign Affairs Select Committee session lasted 2.5 hours and was certainly one of the more remarkable that I've attended, and I have been involved in a number of quite controversial Select Committee hearings over the years. I do think that it showed the Select Committee system at its best, and members across the House worked together, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Hales-Owen, a fellow member of the committee who spoke earlier. And I also share his view that Sir Olly Robbins, who gave us evidence, put in an impressive performance. He is clearly angry at the way he has been treated, and he does have a distinguished career which has been brought to a premature end, and clearly he is very upset by that. But in his evidence, he did make some extraordinary revelations. He, of course, had given evidence to the committee last year in November when, as the chair of the committee suggested in our introduction, we may have heard the truth and nothing but the truth, but probably not the whole truth. This morning we heard a lot more of the whole truth. And what became absolutely clear, and had already been suggested at the previous hearing, was that number 10 Downing Street was absolutely determined that Lord Mandelson should become the ambassador of this country to the United States. Sir Olly told us that his predecessor, Philip Barton, had strongly advised that this should not happen until after the developed vetting process had been completed. But despite that advice from the senior permanent Under-Secretary of the Foreign Office, it was ignored. And indeed, the Cabinet Office, we are told, then went on to suggest that developed vetting might not even be necessary. And yet this was not just a routine appointment. It was not routine for two reasons. Firstly, it was the appointment of probably the most important ambassadorial post that this country has. And secondly, very, very unusually, it was a direct ministerial appointment. Most of the time, ambassadorial appointments are made from within the civil service and people have already had that vetting procedure. This was somebody who was being brought in from the outside, who had not been vetted and already had a track record of having twice had to resign from government. I'll give way.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. And the role of the Prime Minister is the highest honour in UK politics and demands sound judgment. And the reality is there was no sound judgment when he did appoint him, a disgraced individual who had 2 resignations and well-documented associations with a sex offender. And what we hear from the Labour benches today is lambs to the slaughter. They are defending the indefensible, and the general public are hearing that today and are hearing how disgraced this place is by the decision of the Prime Minister to appoint Peter Mandelson.
I completely agree with the Honourable Lady, and it's somehow being suggested from the other side, but it was people advising the Prime Minister. I think one speaker earlier said the Prime Minister had been persuaded to appoint him. Well, I worked for the Prime Minister, and she coined a phrase, officials advise, ministers decide. And in this case, it was the decision, as she says, of the Prime Minister. But Olly Robbins also pointed out that actually, by the time he took up his position, essentially he was presented with a fait accompli. He actually set out to us. He said, I took over as PUS on the 20th of January. He then said, already due diligence had been completed, and we know that that process, which included interview with Morgan McSweeney, had revealed the ongoing relationship between Lord Mandelson and Peter Epstein, but that was ignored. We were told that approval of the appointment had already been given by the King. It had been announced publicly to the press. Agreement had been given from the United States, which is, and Sir Olly Robbins made this clear, that that is not just a formality, there is a very significant development. He'd also been given to the FCDO building and IT access, and finally he was being granted access to highly classified briefing on a case-by-case basis. All of that had happened. And so I asked Sir Olly Robbins if, given all of that was already in place, if now he were to have the appointment withdrawn, would that not damage our relationship with the United States of America? To which he replied very clearly, yes, it would. My right honourable friend, the member for Goole, has already set out, but actually we already had a very good ambassador in Washington, but nevertheless, Downing Street had said to the US administration that they wanted Lord Mandelson to be appointed, and the White House had given their agreement through the agreement procedure. So for Sir Olly Robbins then to withdraw the appointment would have been a real damage to our foreign policy. Now, you can argue that if Sir Olly Robbins were told that the UKSV process had resulted in a clear recommendation denial, then he might, or perhaps even should, still have done so. But he also told us this morning, but he wasn't told that. We were told that he didn't see the UKSV report. We were told that he didn't even see, in fact, he didn't even know about the fact that the report has a red box with a tick in it saying deny. He said he'd never seen those documents before, and that would be normal because it is a very restricted access for the reasons actually the Honourable Gentleman for Hales-Owen set out. And so all he was told was that there had been leaning towards refusal, and it was a borderline case. Now, whether or not that was an accurate reflection of what the report actually said is another matter, and we can perhaps debate at what stage or how far the message from Downing Street we want this person to be appointed had been transmitted to try and make it as possible as it was. But what we are told is that after Sir Olly Robbins had arrived as Permanent Secretary, he was subjected to regular calls from Number 10 saying, get it done. And he also told us that it wasn't get it done subject to security clearance, which in his view it should have been, that the press release put out announcing the appointment of Lord Mandelson didn't say subject to security clearance. Subject to security clearance was never mentioned. This was announced as a decision that had already been taken. Why? That is a matter that we can that is open to conjecture. There is the view of the some on the other side that it was somehow a reward for services given in getting the Prime Minister the job, or the leader of the Liberal Party has said it may all be to do with the trying to cosy up to President Trump, although, as my honourable friend pointed out, actually our previous ambassador have done a really good job in representing this country to President Trump. We may never know. What we do know is that the Prime Minister was absolutely determined that that appointment should be made. And even after the appointment had been made, and when all of these things began to become revealed, in particular the relationship, the ongoing relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which the Prime Minister said that he was unaware of the closeness of, and he was very angry when he was told, there had already been inquiries being made. Journalists have been ringing up Number 10 and saying, but we've been told he failed his security vetting. And Number 10 put out a denial. Now, Number 10, you would expect, if journalists were calling up saying, is it true that actually he didn't pass the UKSV assessment and they recommended denial of security vetting, that before just saying, no, that's complete rubbish, they might actually begin to ask questions. They might say to the Prime Minister, you should be aware, we've had an inquiry about this. But no, apparently none of that happened, or if it did happen, again, it was simply swept under the carpet. The end result of this process is that for over a year, this country had, representing it at the most senior level, in the America, which is our closest ally, someone who the security agencies have concluded is a security risk. We do not know the full extent of the damage that may have been done during that time. The Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid, is coughing at me, so I won't give way. But you know, I fear that there is still more to come, and I can say, I hope on behalf of the Select Committee, that we will continue to pursue this.
Dr. Alison Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I will reiterate my honourable friend from Hales Owen's point that I wish I'd never heard the name Peter Mandelson. He should not have been appointed. It is right that he would have been sacked, and I will acknowledge his experience and expertise on the issue, which I will admit I don't have. Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday, in my response to the Prime Minister's statement focused on Jeffrey Epstein's victims, I briefly mentioned the issue of parties opposite seeking to gain political capital, and much to the chagrin to the reasonable, quiet people of this country, asked for the Prime Minister's resignation, yet again causing chaos to the governance of this country that the opposition is so addicted to. The opposition grumbled at this, as they are doing so now, so I want to take this opportunity to clarify. I will repeat. If we ignore the social media trolls and bots and ignore the self-interest of billionaire-owned right-wing press, the quiet, reasonable majority of people do not want a change of Prime Minister. As one lifelong Tory said to me yesterday, I see the Prime Minister is still here. That is a good thing. They are grateful that this Prime Minister, as a teacher I can out-talk you all, they are grateful that this Prime Minister has not drawn our country into a mad, dangerous conflict, a conflict the opposition would have immediately joined. People value a stable government, a government that focuses on matters people really care about. They want a stabilised economy. They want reform to send and support for schools. They want our NHS rebuilt and waiting lists to drop. They want our roads fixed. They want their wages to increase. They want affordable homes, they want their communities to be safe and welcoming, and they want violence against women and girls tackled. People are fed up of politics and fed up of this navel-gazing over process. They are fed up of more politicians politicking and point-scoring. They are tired of it. And why? I will come to you in a minute. I'm in the flow, and I will promise you I'll come to you. Because after 14 years of the previous government chopping and changing prime ministers and secretaries of state and the blonde bumbler and the loopy letters, this country was on its knees, its people exhausted. The people do not want more of the same, and despite the opposition's constant efforts, we will not let them manufacture more chaos, and I will kindly give way.
To the point that she's just made. Is she familiar with the YouGov poll that regularly asks the UK population how well they think Keir Starmer is doing as Prime Minister? And is she aware that the latest data shows that 70% of the UK population think he's doing badly?
We're glad he's here.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I will say that polls can generate answers depending on how they form their questions, and I will say, if you look at other polls, if we like them, he is still a lot more popular than certain other members present in this House. And in reference to their chaos, I will speak up for the civil service, and I will express empathy to Sir Olly Robinson. In the whirl of Prime Ministers and Ministers of the previous government, among the COVID partying and profiteering, and the party opposite has never apologised, and I will never forgive. The civil service clearly did their best to stop this country from sinking into the mire. In such chaotic conditions, it is no wonder that the culture developed that decisions would be made without fully informing ministers or prime ministers, partially because under the party opposite they probably couldn't be sure who would be the prime minister or minister that month. I will give way.
I think the remaining people who want Starmer to remain Prime Minister are those people who are worried who the Labour Party may pick to have instead. But I wonder if the Honourable Lady would make a comment on. She seems to be saying all sorts of other whataboutery sort of information, but has she considered that actually this is not manufactured? This is a huge national security concern, that we had an ambassador who had access to security information at the highest level, who was a security risk to this country.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I do apologise, I struggle with my hearing. I didn't quite pick up everything that she said, but I will come to the policy about the vetting and security in a second in my speech. I hope that might deliver an answer to her. Do apologise. And I remind the parties opposite that the process they are quibbling about, that this is a policy, I think this might give you the answer, this policy of organisation being able to grant vetting, contrary to advice of the UKSB, has been running for many years under successive governments. It is this Prime Minister, this government, that is now reviewing this process. And I will reiterate the key points. Mandelson should never have been appointed as our ambassador. The Prime Minister has repeatedly acknowledged this and repeatedly apologised. I'm conscious of time. We have a 7-minute guideline, so I will carry on. It is clear that Foreign Office officials granted developed vetting security clearance to Mandelson and never told ministers they'd done so against the recommendations from the vetting agency. This is shocking, and any reasonable person would have assumed that this information would have been proffered without asking. The policy is wrong. It should change, and as a result of the review, hopefully it will change. This government, less than 2 years old still, will not let such a policy continue. I am pleased the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister has immediately suspended the ability of the Foreign Office to grant security clearances, but again, he's not in his seat now, but the Honourable Member for Hales-Owen, I understand that he asked for that to be a short term for other security reasons, and I acknowledge his point. Madam Deputy Speaker, thanks to the previous government and the cryptocurrency fuel damage of reform and, of course, the economic suicide of Brexit, both are responsible for, people are fed up and trust in politics is at an all-time low. And indeed, the Prime Minister recognises this, and he understands the recent revelations has further damaged that trust, and I acknowledge that too. But I stress, Politics can be a force for good. Politics focused on people, not political process. Politics focused on the decent, hard-working people of our country, thankfully still at peace due to the strength of this Prime Minister, can be a force for good. The opposition is still addicted to chaos and game playing, seeking scraps of political capital where they can. I suggest they have flogged this issue as much as they can. They need to focus on rebuilding their dying party and apologise to the people. This Prime Minister and this government is focused on rebuilding this country, the country they broke and still won't apologise for.
Danny Kruger.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister came to this House only yesterday saying in his own words, I will now set out the full timetable, and later insisting he'd come to give the full account to the House. And that followed Downing Street's acceptance earlier in the day that his previous account had at the very least inadvertently misled members. So yesterday was meant to be the great clean-up, the day of the full facts, full candour and full accountability. But today, Sir Olly Robbins gave evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee and published a letter that blows a hole straight through the Prime Minister's version of events. And many honourable members have made the points already exposing this. Obviously, the lack of curiosity on behalf of the Prime Minister was inexplicable and reprehensible. The evasions, the obfuscation, the blame shifting that we've seen, and the blatant contradictions. I want to just point out one that I don't think has been particularly surfaced so far this afternoon. The Prime Minister said that he was astonished. He said it was incredible that information like this could have been withheld from him. But it is significant that in his letter, Sir Olly Robbins says that the position that was conveyed to the committee in September 2025, that I quote, ministers are not informed of any findings other than the final outcome, was agreed with the Cabinet Office and with number 10. So, in other words, the Prime Minister is now trying to dump the entire scandal on one official for acting within a position that Downing Street itself had signed off. That is not accountability, that is a stitch-up. And worse still, we also learned today that before Sir Olly even took over, due diligence on Mandelson's appointment had been completed. Approval had been given by His Majesty. The appointment had been announced. Agreement had been secured from the United States. Mandelson had building and IT access, and he was already receiving highly classified briefing on a case-by-case basis. We've even learned that the Cabinet Office itself raised whether developed vetting was necessary, and the FCDO had to insist on it. So let us drop the pretense that this was some neutral, pristine process derailed by one Mandarin misconducting himself. The appointment was politically driven from the top and forced through in an atmosphere of pressure. Now, of course, the Prime Minister's position is untenable, as many members have said. But if it is possible, the Prime Minister's honesty or position isn't the most important thing about this saga. What matters even more is our system of government, for which the Minister is partly responsible. And if the Prime Minister has been surprised to find that the civil service acts within processes that screen ministers from information and from the power to make decisions, no one else is surprised about this. I think the Prime Minister has spent so long as a civil servant and then as a politician behaving like a civil servant that when he finds that the system doesn't work, he has a sort of professional breakdown and starts spluttering about process and reviews of the processes. Yes, we need process, but the fact is that appointments, like everything else that the government does, are political decisions. Politics is simply the management of the common life of the community, the management of trade-offs between different ideas and interests. And we in this country have developed over many years a model of doing things, of doing politics, that is or was the best in the world. Civil servants, accountable to ministers, accountable to Parliament, accountable to the public. Break those links of accountability, and instead of a hierarchy with the public at the top, ultimately in charge through the ballot box, and civil servants at the bottom, genuinely the servants, the democratically elected masters, instead of that, you have the civil servants at the top, unaccountable. You have ministers floundering around like this lot are. Parliament is pointless, and the public is outraged. So that's what's got to change. A great restoration of the principle that the civil service serves the public. And it does this by respecting the ultimate responsibility of ministers as decision makers. It is absurd to have rules that shield the decision makers from the information they need to make a decision. No other organisation would do this. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is why we need to restore the Armstrong principle set out by Robert Armstrong in 1985, as he said, the civil service has no constitutional personality or responsibility separate from the duly constituted government of the day. So yes, I want to see the back of this Prime Minister, but most of all, I want to dismantle the cabal of permanent secretaries that run this country and restore the proper authority of Parliament. Thank you.
So I am going to try and get more members in to speak, so I'm reducing the informal time limit to 4 minutes. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to start with a point of inquiry that I hope that the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister will be able to answer in his response later, so he's got time to look into it if he doesn't know the answer already. Because yesterday I asked the Prime Minister whether his former Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, passed all his security vetting and whether he ever handled documents for which he had anything other than the appropriate level of clearance. I'm not sure that the House thinks that we got a clear answer from the Prime Minister yesterday to my question. But even if at some point Morgan McSweeney did get clearance, I'm sure that the House would be horrified if this happened long after he started working in Downing Street and after he was involved in the Mandelson appointment. So it would be good to get a date as to when Morgan McSweeney got his security clearance and to confirm whether he handled any materials prior to this for which he didn't have appropriate clearance. If the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister can't find an answer to that question by the time he responds, then perhaps you could answer that in writing by the end of the week, given the urgency of this matter. The situation we're in, of course, raises questions about process. And process is important. But let's not mistake that this is fundamentally political. Politics drove this. Something that was unusual about the appointment of Mandelson was that it was a political appointment. It isn't standard for the Ambassador to the United States to be a political appointment. Whatever Peter Mandelson is and was, and I have my own opinions on that, he wasn't a career civil servant, and he'd been up to other things, and so the security vetting was clearly very important indeed. But the fact that this was fundamentally political, a political decision by the Prime Minister, driven as well by Morgan McSweeney, is evidenced by the fact that everyone in here knows that the Prime Minister wouldn't have signed off someone with Peter Mandelson's record to stand as a Labour candidate for a town council. Yet he was eased into the incredibly important position of Ambassador to the United States of America. And I will give way.
Honourable Member for giving way, and I think he's getting to the nub of the issue here. This is about fairness in society, and we tell everybody else outside of here who we make the rules for, play by the rules. But when you're in here yourself, when you're the chief man, you can do what you want. And that is what's flying in the face of the vast majority of public. Would you agree?
I totally agree with the honourable member, and she makes a very powerful point, and that's why the public are so outraged. And it was a political appointment. And the reason the Prime Minister was so grateful to Mandelson was because of the role that he and Morgan McSweeney played in getting him to be leader of the Labour Party through that organisation, Labour Together. And what was it that made them think that Peter Mandelson was such a wise political appointment? It was because of what Peter Mandelson represented. Peter Mandelson epitomised the idea that the role of the Labour Party isn't what it was set up to do, which is to be a voice for working class people and the trade union movement, speaking truth to power and changing society in the interest of the many, not the few. But it is, in fact, an organisation that should be closer and closer to the super rich and powerful. It is because of Mandelson's proximity to the super rich and to the powerful that he was appointed to that role. And that's what led to decisions, and I'll come to the end, that's what led to decisions which has made the Prime Minister and the government unpopular. That's what's led to decisions like the cuts to the winter fuel payment, the cuts to disability benefits, because the idea, the vision that Mandelson put forward is one which has polluted our party, and that's why we need a full and independent investigation into Labour Together, the organisation favoured by Mandelson, by McSweeney, and which has dragged this party through the gutter, and when we saw certain nefarious practices tested in our party in opposition, now brought into government. That needs to change, because otherwise where we're going to end up with is despair, leading to the election of a Trump-style government in this country led by reform, something which no decent person in this House should want to see happen.
David Simmons.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I first crossed paths with the Prime Minister when he and I were both working to improve the way our country deals with cases of child sexual exploitation. And one of the principles which was enshrined in law across our society as a result of that was accountability, the golden thread between the leaders, managerial and political, and those who follow their instructions. And it was very clear that if you led an organisation where mistakes were made, if you ignored the warnings, you were accountable, or you created a culture in which those warnings were not properly shared, you were accountable. And it is not at all clear why the Prime Minister, since all he learnt and all he did in those days, has decided to abandon that position. It was said of the Prime Minister, pretty much the first time I have seen him angry was when he commissioned this report. He was angry because he did not know. He wondered why the escalation process did not permit the case to be referred up to his office. Those words do not refer to anything to do with Peter Mandelson. They date to the decision of the Crown Prosecution Service not to proceed against Jimmy Savile. But those words in The Guardian could refer exactly to the matter that we are debating today. So I gently say to the members opposite that whilst past performance is not a guide to the future, this is a Prime Minister who has got form in deploying exactly this defence when caught out. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot let this debate pass without raising an issue which is of great concern to my many constituents who are workers at HMS Warrior, the base in Northwood, just on the edge of my constituency. As my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, has set out, as a result of the Prime Minister's dismissive attitude to vetting, the pressure he placed on officials, an individual was given access to intelligence on which my constituents rely to keep them safe when they are undertaking operations at a very high level of personal risk for the benefit and the long-term interests of this country. And the Prime Minister refuses to accept any accountability for the risks that his decision may have placed my constituents and their loved ones and so many other people who serve our country at. So I hope this Minister will be able, on behalf of the Prime Minister, to give the House an unambiguous assurance that whatever was shared with the Prime Minister, whatever was shared with ministers, that the necessary minimum risk mitigations were put in place so that we can be confident at least that this government thought to try and keep my constituents and those who serve our country safe.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister apologised to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, but where was that sense of responsibility when he made the decision regarding Peter Mandelson? And where was that sense of responsibility when he actively chose to ignore information that was already in the public domain? This morning, the Energy Secretary said, Prime Ministers make errors, Prime Ministers are fallible, Prime Ministers are human, but I'm struggling to understand how the gravity of misjudgment in this political appointment can be explained away as a simple human error. This is not a split-second judgment. This was not a decision made of urgent necessity under pressure in the heat of the moment. This was a deliberate, considered political appointment made in full knowledge of the political priorities involved. Morgan McSweeney even swore it through. What is more is that members on the opposite benches were given lines to take yesterday, prompted to quote a victim of Epstein in defence of the Prime Minister. And when Mandelson was appointed last year, their suffering was of no consequence to the government when they weighed it in the scales and found which side they wanted to come down on. In truth, it is thanks to the bravery of victims like Virginia Giuffre that Epstein's crimes are even in the public domain. Her sister-in-law, Amanda Roberts, said this about Mandelson's sacking last year. Our governments have allowed these people to hold their status and their title without shame. It is unfair we continuously pull these skeletons out, that survivors have to continuously point the finger for us to do the right thing. These were women and children who were trafficked and abused by a network of men who acted with confidence that they were untouchable, too powerful to challenge and too protected ever to be brought down. And truly it raises the uncomfortable question of whether Peter Mandelson's familiarity with that world was treated as a skill set rather than a red flag. Was he chosen precisely because he was comfortable rubbing shoulders with the sort of men who shared private jets with Epstein, rather than in spite of it? So how can the Prime Minister now express sympathy for victims of crimes committed by a man whose closest associates he chose to elevate? How can he claim to share their pain when he made himself the very decision that caused such distress for them? And just this morning, Sir Olly Robbins told the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that Downing Street asked the Foreign Office to find a senior diplomatic role for the Prime Minister's then communications chief, Matt Doyle, even though Doyle had campaigned for a friend charged with possessing indecent images of children. This is the government that promised to turn the page on Tory sleaze and restore trust and integrity to British politics. Instead, not once, but twice, the Prime Minister pressured the civil service to appoint friends of known sex offenders to senior diplomatic roles. To close, Madam Deputy Speaker, the facts were known, the associations were known, the public record was clear, this was a public decision, it was a wrong decision of such magnitude that the only conclusion will be to end the Starmer administration. And that is when the Labour Party, of course, decides to do it, because that is the Labour Party's responsibility.
Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and I both asked the Prime Minister whether he knew about Peter Mandelson's role as a director at Starmer when he appointed him to be the ambassador to the United States. Given that the Prime Minister didn't answer our question then, I will repeat the facts of that case and ask the Minister to clarify. From 2013 until at least 2017, Peter Mandelson served as a director for Starmer, a Russian conglomerate which invests heavily in Russia's military-industrial complex. This means that Mandelson remained a director at Starmer after Russia's annexation of Crimea. It also means that he would have maintained close contacts with figures linked to the Russian government, including Starmer's former chairman, Vladimir Yevtushenko, who is currently subject to sanctions as a result of his links to Vladimir Putin. Any sensible Prime Minister would want to consider these facts carefully before appointing somebody to a sensitive diplomatic post, and would give proper consideration to whether those relationships would leave that person exposed to Russian influence. This is particularly true in the case of Peter Mandelson, who has a long history of improper financial conduct. In November 2024, the Cabinet Secretary advised the Prime Minister to conduct security vetting on prospective candidates before appointing anybody to the ambassador's post in Washington. In December 2024, the Prime Minister ignored that guidance and appointed Peter Mandelson anyway. In January 2025, the Prime Minister repeatedly insisted before the press and the public that Peter Mandelson had passed security vetting, despite the fact that was not the case. And when asked yesterday, he twice refused to confirm that he knew about Peter Mandelson's links to Starmer, despite the fact that the advice that he received in December 2024 explicitly pointed it out. That advice included the following quote: Mandelson served as a non-executive director of the Russian conglomerate Starmer, which is itself the majority shareholder of RTI, a defence technology company. Mandelson remained on the board until June 2017, long after Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So either the Prime Minister is still reluctant to share with us all the information we deserve, or he didn't read the advice that he was given, despite insisting repeatedly that his decision to appoint Mandelson was based on that advice. So, in light of this, could the Minister tell us definitively this afternoon whether the Prime Minister considered these facts about Peter Mandelson's role at Systema when appointing him? Yes or no? If he did not, why did he not read his brief? And if he did, why did he not consider them sufficiently concerning to abandon, or at the very least, pause to reconsider the appointment of Peter Mandelson to arguably our most important and most security-sensitive ambassadorial role? The Prime Minister has spoken extensively about what he did not know, but we and the British public are incredulous that he did not ask. We do know that the Prime Minister knew about these Russian links. So what questions did he ask about these facts? What questions did he ask officials? What questions did he ask Mandelson? Or did he simply not want to know?
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, everybody said pretty much everything, but I'm going to say some of it again, as is my wont in this chamber. But I have to say, first of all, my congratulations to my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, who laid out a powerful case against the government, and particularly against the Prime Minister and his excuses in all of this. But today I thought we had something really very intriguing take place, which is we had the person that had just been sacked brought to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee to give testimony about what this was all about. And what we really learned was how much that this government had wanted, for some reason, Peter Mandelson to take over that job of being ambassador, that they drove everything aside in the pursuit of this, bullying civil servants, essentially sacking one of them because he didn't give the answers, it appears, that they wanted, and excusing themselves on the basis that everybody else was wrong and they were right. Well, they weren't, and this has now come home to roost. And so the essential fact of this is, you know, many of us knew about Mandelson's activities. I have literally here a great dossier on him about his links with China, hundreds of names to do with the people he had met and who he had been giving details of all sorts of things to. We know now that he lobbied the government. He lobbied them over electric vehicles and the tariff. Outrageous, really. Continued to put pressure on them, even when he was given the job. That is the nature of the man, still repaying his links back to China. And we've heard from my honourable friend about his links with Systema in Russia. But there's copious evidence, even on those alone, why Peter Mandelson should never have been allowed in any government post whatsoever. Before there was any attempt to inspect that, it was in the public domain. And there is no way on earth that the right honourable gentleman is going to get up here and talk about faults within the system and not getting clarity. Nonsense. Everybody that wanted to know knew. We knew about it. In the Interparliamentary Alliance for China, we had all the details. They were published. There is no excuse for the government to say, we waited for the Foreign Office to deliver this great thing and they didn't tell us. They knew. Number one, they knew. And the second point about this is the way they manipulated this, which is shocking, absolutely shocking. The outgoing Cabinet Secretary, after what he saw in the Cabinet Office's review of this, the due diligence, which, by the way, is not the same as what the Foreign Office was doing. This was a search through to have a look and recommendations to government. They showed just how tainted this man was, this corrupt man and corrupting man, how tainted he was and what he had been up to. And seeing that, he made the advice to government, which is the job of a Cabinet Secretary, that you shouldn't go ahead to appoint, you should wait for this full review to take place, and one way or the other for him to be cleared or not cleared. But the government didn't do that, and that's the other question. In what world would they go ahead, despite that advice, sensible, reasonable advice? Why do they press on? Not only do they press on, but at such speed, and they put the King, His Majesty the King, in the firing line on this. You know, it's here, they approve the appointment, and it goes to the King, because they've now declared it, even though they haven't had clearance. The agreement has been given to the US partners. What in heaven's name could have happened later on? And none of the stuff to do with Epstein was even in the middle of this argument, which it would become. So the man is utterly corrupt, and they want him as our ambassador. And he's given highly... And this is the other bit about today that I found astonishing. The admission by the ex-permanent secretary, Olly Robbins, that he understood that despite the fact that he wasn't cleared, he had been given strap clearance to see documents of such importance that they could have brought the government and the country down. And I'm going to end on this, Madam Deputy Speaker, because you've been most tolerant. I simply say this. The Prime Minister is in the firing line on this one for very good reasons. He's in charge, and he knew what was going on. The people he sacked are still in the firing line because they cannot weasel out of this. They committed an offence in the books of anybody in this single chamber. And the right honourable gentleman will be in the firing line because he's been put here to literally try and tell some story about how this was none of the Prime Minister's fault. He has been economical with the actuality and terminally inexact. And all I can say is no more terminal inexactitudes, please, when he gets to the dispatch box.
Dr. Ali Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And before I begin my remarks on the appointment of Peter Mandelson as UK Ambassador to the US, I just want to stress my profound respect for the victims and survivors of the disgusting child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. I very much hope that they are in the minds of all of us in this chamber today as we debate this, and because we should remain mindful that the chain of events that has led us to this point, that's brought us here, actually stems from their bravery in standing up and speaking out to expose Epstein's crimes. Now, what's at stake here is actually the future of the Prime Minister. Certainly questions of the Prime Minister's judgment. The Prime Minister's sole defence appears to be that he just wasn't told. But it's clear that the Prime Minister, first of all, didn't understand the security vetting process and actually didn't want to understand that. He didn't want to do the security vetting process in the first place. He created a culture of political pressure that overrode that process. And finally, he's thrown a civil servant under the bus for failures that should be placed very clearly at his own door. He didn't clearly understand the process. There was a process of UKSV doing the developed vetting, and then of the Foreign Office considering that. Now, we've had Sir Olly Robbins giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee today, saying that there was, a degree of grey area, that it was borderline, that he only had a verbal briefing. He didn't even see the piece of paper that made it clear that UKSV felt that Mandelson should not pass developed vetting. But Sir Olly Robbins says that he decided that there could be mitigations to be put in place in that system. This is clearly a process that the Prime Minister himself didn't understand, despite the fact that at least one honourable member has said today it was very clearly notified to him in advance. The Prime Minister didn't even want to do this process. Again, it's clear from Olly Robbins' testimony today that there was a tussle between Number 10 and the Foreign Office about whether to undertake the vetting at all before Sir Olly Robbins took up his position, with Number 10 just wanting to rush through the appointment about it, and the previous Permanent Secretary had to really dig his heels in order to insist that the vetting was done. And then the FCDO was subsequently hassled by Number 10 to get the appointment done before Trump's inauguration, without any curiosity or any caveats about whether the vetting was passed. The Prime Minister asked no questions. He displayed terminal professional incuriosity, willful ignorance, totally unacceptable. It's clear that no value was placed on the vetting process by number 10, despite the PM now claiming that he's completely staggered that he was not told about it. Indeed, Olly Robbins today said that Number 10 had a dismissive attitude towards the vetting. And Number 10 put in place a culture that established, again in the words of Mr Robbins, a very, very strong expectation that vetting would be passed. There was no culture of paying attention to due process. There was simply a culture of getting a political appointee in post as quickly as possible with the minimal scrutiny. And it didn't just apply to Mandelson, it applied to, again, as we heard today from Olly Robbins, Matthew Doyle, where a request came from number 10 to put him into a political, into a position without even informing the Foreign Secretary. And now the PM has a temper tantrum and sacks the civil servant because he's furious about this. The country is furious with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has previously said he takes responsibility for mistakes made in his team, but there is no accountability on show today. There is no responsibility taken by the Prime Minister. This is just one of numerous errors of judgment by the Prime Minister. He should resign.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and indeed, as others have already said, you almost feel like everything has been said at this point, but one thing that strikes me in all of this is that this is called the House of Commons. Our job is to come here and represent the common person. And it is so far removed from the common person, this entire debate. As I said last night, if one of my constituents in Lagan Valley is accidentally overpaid on a benefit, that's clawed back. No matter the cost to that person, the human cost, that's clawed back right away. No questions asked, no special circumstances, and we see that writ large across our public life. And the reason being is because we said that we valued a rules-based, ordered system. We wanted a society that was fair, and we valued integrity, and we valued trust, but more importantly, we wanted to understand that the people that came to this house were going to act in a way that was beyond reproach, that was going to act in a way that they expected everyone else across the UK to behave. Now I have a guy, disabled, accidentally parked in a parking space, didn't have his blue badge displayed, and he's getting hammered. He's getting hammered. Maybe he'll get off, who knows. But we are dealing with a situation where the Prime Minister of the day is now saying that he regrets the appointment of Mandelson. Yeah. And I'm not going to get into the whys and wherefores of DV and strap and CTC and everything else, because my people in Lagan Valley don't know what that means. And a lot of people are banking on the ordinary man and woman on the street not to know what that means, and to stop being curious, and to suspend their expectations, because this is all highfalutin serious stuff and we don't really know what that is. Maybe they did do right, maybe they didn't do right, because they're bamboozled. But I'm going to break it down for them. I would say this to the Prime Minister. What was it about the twice disgraced, paedophile-adjacent, self-styled Prince of Darkness that you found so attractive to put into this plum job, not just of government, but of the United Kingdom on the world stage? Yeah. What was it, Prime Minister, that appealed to you about Peter Mandelson? We still don't have the answer. No. We still don't have the answer. No. But all I know is that my constituents are disgusted with all of this. Yeah. And this isn't the first time, it's not the second time, it's not the third time. It has been going round in a merry-go-round, no matter who it is. And I'm really glad that the member for Liverpool West Derby is in the chamber, because he has worked tirelessly to make sure that issues at the nub of this, the duty of candour, the obligation to be honest with the public, let alone your colleagues and the entire administration. And yet we're telling families that they can't access documents for another 100 years due to technicality? How am I making that make sense to them? And I am indignant, and I am outraged. And a lot of people in this building are expecting us to no longer be outraged. We'll be outraged. Because if we can't prove that this works, we know he's going to step into the shadows. We know he's going to be out there setting the algorithms. We know who is going to be preying on the carcass of what was a once great democracy. And we've seen other democracies fail. Let's not fool ourselves that the UK is immune from this. And the number one thing we can do within our gift is to show that we still value integrity. And for those reasons, there is not a single excuse that this government can come up with that I can sell to my constituents or myself that I will believe. And for those reasons, I believe that the Prime Minister needs to go, not just for his own party, but more importantly, for the sake of the country.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I sat through yesterday over 2.5 hours of questions and responses to the Prime Minister, pretty much responses focused on process, when really what's fundamental to the issue at hand is judgment and national security. Now, I really don't think you need to have some sort of fancy UK vetting or whatever it's called dossier to know that Mandelson is a risk to national security.
Exactly.
But what's more, above and beyond the impact on the victims of Epstein, is the fact that surely the FCDO and the machineries of government knew that the American administration had information on Epstein, had compromising information, very likely, on Epstein, given Mandelson's close association with Epstein, and they were going to appoint somebody to, admittedly an ally, but nevertheless a foreign power, to negotiate with that foreign power very difficult, critical negotiations to the national interest, knowing it's highly likely that country has compromising information on that individual. That, for me, is the most egregious fundamental failure in terms of protecting our national security. And we know, and we have learnt, this was a political decision. This was the Prime Minister's decision. But what more, this reflects on all ministers given collective responsibility.
Yeah.
Now, I believe in forgiveness. I strongly believe in forgiveness. And the Prime Minister has come here and he has apologised of sorts. It's been a very caveated apology. I didn't know. People didn't tell me. People lied and lied and lied to my team. We know apologies only count, they only have value if you truly believe you did something wrong. The Prime Minister needs to finally show some leadership and take responsibility for his actions for all of us.
Ian Solemn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box for nearly 2.5 hours, and he said on at least 12 occasions that appointing Mandelson was an error of judgment. His judgment. He apologised for it. He said he took responsibility for it. But at no point, not once in that 2.5 hours, did he tell this House what his error of judgment was, or exactly where he went wrong in his reasoning. Madam Deputy Speaker, that distinction matters. Saying I should not have appointed him is a description of an outcome. It is not an account of a judgment. It's like saying I should not have crashed the car without accounting for the actions that led to the crash. Because whether the driver was speeding or distracted or asleep at the wheel, the answer matters. It matters for understanding what went wrong, it matters for preventing it happening again, and it matters for judging whether the driver should still be behind the wheel. The difference is not a technicality, it is the difference between meaningful accountability and accountability that is merely performative, between a Prime Minister who owns his decisions and one who merely acknowledges them. Accountability to this House is not a constitutional nicety, it is the condition on which this House and the people we all represent grant the government the authority to act at all. We all know what was in the due diligence report the Prime Minister received in December 2024. The twice resigned minister, the China connections, the Russia connections, the Epstein association that continued after conviction. The Prime Minister received that report. He has confirmed he knew its contents, but he proceeded anyway. That was his judgment. And it is that judgment, not the vetting process, not the Foreign Office chain of command, not Sir Olly Robbins, that this House has not been given an account of. Instead, yesterday we received a detailed, exhaustive account of what officials failed to tell him. Yet the more exhaustive the catalogue of official failures becomes, the more completely the Prime Minister's own reasoning disappears from view. You cannot simultaneously claim an error of judgment and outsource its explanation to official failure. He has offered us an alibi instead of an explanation, an account that places him away from the scene of the crash. Yesterday's statement was a masterclass in process that the Prime Minister was apparently unaware of. It was not an account of a judgment. This morning, Sir Olly Robbins told the Foreign Affairs Committee that Number 10 showed no interest in whether Mandelson would receive clearance, only when. That there was, in his words, a generally dismissive attitude to Mandelson's vetting, with focus only on getting him to Washington quickly. This is not a picture of a Prime Minister kept in the dark by officials. The alibi, it turns out, has witnesses, and they are not saying what the Prime Minister told us yesterday. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has wide executive latitude. He is entitled to make difficult appointments. He is entitled to weigh competing considerations and reach conclusions that others would not reach. That is what governing requires. But the latitude is not unconditional. It comes with a democratic obligation to account for his reasoning to this House and to the people we represent. Not to describe outcomes, not to catalogue process, but to explain his judgment. What did the Prime Minister weigh? What did he conclude? And where in his reasoning did he think he went wrong? Yesterday he told us 12 times that he made an error of judgment. But he has not told us once what that error actually was. We still don't know how he crashed that car, and this House demands an answer.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday's statement from the Prime Minister should have brought clarity. Instead, it has left this House with more questions than answers. And this isn't a narrow procedural issue. It goes to the judgment of the Prime Minister. And that's really a disgrace, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that he's not here today to answer questions. Perhaps the usual excuse that he wasn't told holds clear. So let me begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, with the exchange I had with the Prime Minister yesterday, because it crystallises the problem. On the 4th of February, the Prime Minister told my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, that the vetting process had disclosed information relating to Epstein. Yesterday, he attempted to rope that back by saying he had conflated vetting with due diligence, before then insisting he understood the distinction. Those positions cannot comfortably sit together.
No.
If he understood the distinction, why give an answer that conflated the two? If he did not, why claim certainty at the dispatch box? His defence that due diligence forms part of the wider process does not answer the question he was actually asked at the time. And if that is not misleading the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's difficult to see what is. And that lack of clarity runs through the entire account. The Prime Minister confirmed that he chose not to follow the advice of his then Cabinet Secretary Lord Keir in November of 2024 to carry out vetting before he appointed Mandelson. That advice was clear and obvious. Instead, the Prime Minister now relies on a later review by Chris Wormold, which merely says the approach may be usual, not that it was right. So the question remains, why was the advice rejected when it mattered? The Prime Minister's account of what he knew is equally difficult to reconcile. He says he had confidence that the vetting process had addressed the most serious concerns. Yet he also says that he'd not seen the vetting report. If he'd not seen the report, on what basis did his confidence rest? If he was relying on the Cabinet Office due diligence paper, why was that not made clear at the time when he was specifically asked about security vetting? Why was a direct question met with an answer that did not address it at all? The contents of the due diligence paper raised further questions. It highlighted connections to Russian and Chinese interests. It referred to involvement with Starmer, a company embedded in Russia's industrial and military structures, with well-known links to Kremlin-aligned figures. This information wasn't hidden, it was in the public domain and placed directly before the Prime Minister in December 2024. So why did none of that trigger greater caution and, more importantly, greater action? And most seriously of all, the Foreign Affairs Committee heard evidence from Sir Olly Robbins today consistent with Mandelson being able to act in a role and have exposure to sensitive material before that process had concluded. And we also discovered the Prime Minister's team tried to put Matthew Doyle, another friend of a known paedophile, into an ambassadorial position.
Shocking.
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are left with this. We still have no clear account of who knew what and when. No clarity on what decisions were taken, where responsibility lay, or how this situation was allowed to develop. But I think we do understand why. This is about judgment. Time and time again, the Prime Minister has shown a willingness to appoint individuals despite serious concerns about their record.
Yeah.
A Transport Secretary with a fraud conviction, an anti-corruption minister under investigation, a homelessness minister with a record that raises profound questions, and a Deputy Prime Minister who failed to meet her own tax obligations. And in this case, despite personal associations that should have raised the most serious red flags, despite connections to hostile states, and despite a long and controversial history in public life, the Prime Minister judged Peter Mandelson to be a suitable candidate for one of the most sensitive ambassadorial roles because of his influence over the Labour Party and the Prime Minister himself. This is not a failure of process, it is a failure of judgment. And with judgment like that, this Prime Minister is not fit to lead this country for a moment longer.
Edward Morella.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this morning Sir Olly Robbins appeared in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. What I saw was a dedicated public servant who over 25 years has held some of the most senior roles in the civil service. The Prime Minister would like us to believe that he was let down by officials like Sir Olly. But in truth, it was the officials who were let down by the Prime Minister. They were let down by a Prime Minister who decided to appoint to the highest diplomatic post in the Foreign Office a person with a known association with a convicted paedophile who had been forced out of government on previous occasions for personal failings. Having made that decision, Number 10 was determined to ram it through. We have heard of the repeated calls to Olly Robbins' private office demanding that they get it done and do it quickly. Number 10 even went so far as to arguing that the vetting process wasn't necessary at all. It was the FCDO officials who insisted that the proper process be applied. It was thanks to that decision that there were risk mitigations in place at all. Other members have raised concerns about security. But if it wasn't for officials insisting on security vetting and the imposition of mitigations, how much worse would the national security risk have been to the UK? This is not the Prime Minister being let down by officials. It is officials clearing up the Prime Minister's mess. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister wants us to believe that the appointment of Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the US was a singular error of judgment. However, we now know, as a result of Sir Olly Robbins' evidence, that Number 10 also sought an ambassadorial appointment for the Prime Minister's Director of Communications, Matthew Doyle. Appointing one friend of a paedophile as an ambassador might be an error of judgment. Attempting to appoint two looks like no judgment at all. In his statement to the House yesterday, the Prime Minister says it beggars belief that officials in the Foreign Office saw fit to withhold information from ministers. However, we have now learned that Number 10, having sought an ambassadorial position for Matthew Doyle, ordered Sir Olly not to tell the Foreign Secretary about it at all. On the one hand, the Prime Minister thinks officials should not withhold information. On the other hand, Number 10 are ordering officials to withhold information. Who is letting down who? Madam Deputy Speaker, today I saw a diligent, committed, proud and passionate civil servant who worked unbelievably hard for this country and for this Prime Minister. The Prime Minister may have found someone to fire, but the decision to appoint Peter Mandelson was his. The decision to ram that appointment through was his. The decision to announce the appointment before security had been completed was his. The Prime Minister is running out of people to fire. It is time he answered for them.
The Minister will be called at 5 p.m. precisely, so with the remaining time, Jim Allister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the focus of many members was asking the question of the Prime Minister why he never thought to ask whether Mandelson had had security clearance. There was great reticence about asking that question. But today we discovered there was no such reticence in Number 10 when it came to trying to meddle in this process. we heard from Sir Olly Robbins this morning that the message was very clear from Number 10. The Prime Minister wants this done at pace. The Prime Minister didn't tell us that yesterday. This had nothing to do with him. This was an independent process. Never once did he tell us that his officials told the Foreign Office this must be done at pace. We heard from Sir Olly this morning that there was an atmosphere of pressure from Number 10, that throughout January there was constant pressure to get it done, some of it laced with expletives. Get it done. And then Sir Olly came to the point of telling us it would have been very difficult not to approve Mandelson. That in the context of the meddling, of the pressure, of the insistence that it should be done and done at pace. And that in a context where the Cabinet Office even, he reported, said there should be no need to vet Lord Mandelson. Think of it. The man twice dismissed, the man with a litany of black marks against him as a public official, and the Cabinet Office, at the heart of this government, protested there was no need to vet Mandelson. What we had on display in the appointment of Mandelson was an unbridled, unabashed display of cronyism of the highest and most disgusting order, and corroborated by what at the very same time was happening in respect of Matthew Doyle. At the very same time, in the same early months of 2025, the Prime Minister, who wanted to rush through to get Mandelson approved, was also secretly behind the backs, not just of this Parliament, behind the backs of his Foreign Secretary, was saying, could Matthew Doyle be found an ambassadorial post? But don't tell the Foreign Secretary. That is the circumstance that prevailed in the Prime Minister's Number 10. And yet he comes to this House and he tells us, nothing to do with me, Gov. People didn't tell me. I'm innocent because I didn't know. Well, as a lawyer, he should know ignorance is no defence. And as a lawyer, he should be, his training, his instinct should be to interrogate, not to cover up. Sadly, what we've had in this case is a monumental failure, not just of process, failure of character, failure of judgment, failure of leadership, and he should go.
Minister Durham Jones.
Mr. Speaker, today's motion asks this House to consider the government's accountability to this place regarding Peter Mandelson's appointment. The government has been and remains fully committed to keeping the House informed of all relevant information related to Peter Mandelson's appointment and subsequent dismissal as Ambassador to the United States. Government ministers have addressed this House on a number of occasions on this matter. The Prime Minister has set out to this House that while much of the debate on this issue has focused on process, at the heart of all of this is the decision to appoint Peter Mandelson in the first place. The Prime Minister has been upfront about that and takes responsibility for it. The Prime Minister knows that he should not have made the appointment. He regrets the decision and he apologises, in particular to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein for doing so. Those women and girls have been subject to intolerable cruelty, disgusting abuse, and yet to date without justice. And their experiences should be taken seriously and they should be listened to. So, Mr. Speaker, I do not come to the House today to defend that decision. It was the wrong one. I am here, however, to account for the government's accountability to this House on the process that followed. Mr. Speaker, I take the government's responsibility to this House seriously, and so I will not take this opportunity this evening to try to score party political points or to defend a decision that the Prime Minister himself has said is wrong and for which he apologises. But I do commit to returning to this House as often as required. I give way.
For the Minister giving way. In taking this wrong decision, did the Prime Minister follow due process?
The Prime Minister followed the process that was in place, and I will turn to some of the details of that in the remainder of my statement. Mr. Speaker, on the 11th of March, I addressed the House in response to the humble address, as we released the first tranche of documents relating to Peter Mandelson's appointment and his subsequent dismissal. I committed to keep the House updated as we work to publish documents relevant to that humble address, and I recommit to do so today. I would like to reassure the House that we are proceeding at pace to process the outstanding documents, a number of which are currently in the process of being reviewed by the Intelligence and Security Committee of this Parliament, with the aim of publishing the next tranche of documents as a matter of urgency. In the debate, Mr. Speaker, I was asked specifically about a question of redactions in respect to documents being published in relation to the humble address. I'll just be clear that redactions are visible on the face of the document by the black marking out of information. If there is no marking out, it is not a redaction. And all redactions are agreed via the Intelligence and Security Committee before they come to this House. Sure.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. We've heard a lot from the other side today about process, but can the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister please tell my constituents, tell the House and the country why on earth did the Prime Minister appoint Peter Mandelson to be the ambassador to the United States?
I refer you to the Prime Minister's, I prefer the Honourable Gentleman to the Prime Minister's words, Mr. Speaker, but also to reiterate his apology for having made that wrong decision in the first place. Mr. Speaker, I'll now move to the specific matter of security vetting. As the House heard from the Prime Minister yesterday, on the evening of the 14th of April, he was told for the first time that last year, before Peter Mandelson took up his position as ambassador, that the Foreign Office had granted Peter Mandelson developed vetting clearance against the recommendation of the United Kingdom Security Vetting Authority, UKSV. Again, Mr. Speaker, in the debate this evening, there have been accusations that the Cabinet Office had suggested that developed vetted status or the process to seek that was not necessary. Those accusations are inaccurate, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm to the House, based on advice that I've received, that a question was asked by the Foreign Office of the Cabinet Office team whether, on the basis that Peter Mandelson was already a member of the House of Lords and a Privy Councillor, whether further developed vetting status was required. That then subsequently took place, as members of the House know. The Foreign Office officials who made the decision to overrule the recommendation of UKSV then failed to notify the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary or her predecessor, the Deputy Prime Minister or any other minister, including myself, including the former Cabinet Secretary, Sir Chris Wormold. That has been confirmed today in evidence by Sir Olly Robbins to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I'll give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. I've been listening to this entire saga being described, and it is confusing even for someone who's a Westminster insider in the Westminster bubble. Can I ask a question about process? Because he's mentioned the 14th of April, when the Prime Minister was notified that there had been a breach in the security vetting and it had been failed on one extent. At that point, could he explain to me the process of what the Prime Minister would have had to do to gather all the information before coming to the House? So who would he have to speak to? What legal advice did he have to take? Who would he have to consult? And what permission did he have to have? This is important. What information did he need to have before he came back to the House? I want to know, and my constituents want to know.
I thank my honourable friend. As the Prime Minister's made clear to the House, and indeed via the publication of a minute of the meeting in which he was informed of this information, the Prime Minister made it immediately clear to his officials that he intended to come to this House to inform members of Parliament of the situation that he had just been told, but that he needed an urgent set of information about who had made what decision when in order to be able to provide the full facts to Parliament. On Tuesday the 14th, this is when the Prime Minister instructed officials to establish the facts urgently. And Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister that he should have been informed of this a long time ago, as should this House. There were multiple opportunities for this issue to have been raised, not just including when the decision to grant Peter Mandelson developed vetting status was initially made, but then subsequently when the Prime Minister asked the former Cabinet Secretary to assure him that all due process had been followed, and he had been assured of that, and then subsequently when the Foreign Secretary and the then Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Office provided a signed statement to the Foreign Affairs Committee confirming, and I quote, Peter Mandelson's security vetting was conducted to the usual standard in line with established Cabinet Office policy.
The Prime Minister has clearly said that he was right to sack the senior civil servant, Oliver Robbins. So can the Minister guarantee that the government will contest any employment claim from Sir Oliver Robbins for unfair or constructive dismissal all the way to the Employment Tribunal and will not use taxpayers' money to pay off this gentleman to avoid that outcome?
The Honourable Lady will know I am not at liberty to comment in respect of any potential claim to the Employment Tribunal. Peter Mandelson's security vetting was carried out by UKSV between the 23rd of December 2024 and the 28th of January 2025. This included collecting relevant information and interviewing the applicant, in this case, on 2 occasions. One issue was raised in the debate about this particular time period, where there is suggestion that Number 10 applied pressure on officials at the Foreign Office in relation to the security vetting process. It was confirmed in testimony today before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that no such pressure was applied beyond asking for the process to be completed as quickly as possible, and by Sir Olly Robbins that no personal contact was made of him via telephone or message, testimony from the official himself in front of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Then, on the 28th of January 2025, UKSV recommended to the Foreign Office that developed vetting clearance should not be granted to Peter Mandelson. The following day, on the 29th of January 2025, Foreign Office officials made the decision to grant developed vetting clearance for Peter Mandelson nonetheless. This was an established process for the Foreign Office, which had the authority to be able to make those decisions. And it is worth reiterating this for the sake of clarity, as the Prime Minister did yesterday, that UKSV makes decisions for many departments in government, but not for the Foreign Office. The final decision on developed vetting clearance is made by Foreign Office officials, not by UKSV. When I became aware of the details of Peter Mandelson's case, following the publication of Guardian reporting last Thursday, I was then briefed on this matter that evening at the Cabinet Office by officials, both in respect of the case of Peter Mandelson, but also the existing policy regarding UKSV recommendations and the Foreign Office's decisions. I immediately suspended the right for the Foreign Office to overrule UKSV recommendations pending further investigation. And in reply to my honourable friend from Hales Owen, I can confirm that the review that Adrian Fulford will be conducting for the government should be completed in around 4 weeks, so that we can take a quick decision to the proper functioning of the process.
I'm grateful for the Round giving way. Actually, in his letter, Olly Robinson's letter to the committee today, he actually countermands what the Honourable Gentleman said from the dispatch box. He says, I believe the Cabinet Office raised whether vetting was actually necessary. I understand the FCDO insisted that it was the requirement before Mandelson took the post to Washington. After their due diligence, they were insisting it wasn't necessary. Surely he needs to retract.
I repeat my words and refer back to them. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about the ability of officials to disclose sensitive vetting information. As the Prime Minister has set out, I accept that the sensitive personal information provided by an individual being vetted must be protected from disclosure. If that were not the case, the integrity of the whole process would be compromised. However, what neither the Prime Minister nor I accept is that the appointing minister cannot be told of the recommendation made by UKSV, nor does the government accept that Foreign Office officials could not have informed the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary or the Cabinet Secretary of UKSV's recommendation, whilst also maintaining the necessary confidentiality that vetting requires. The Civil Service Code on this issue is clear, not in just normal practice, but especially in relation to when ministers are giving evidence to Parliament, as was the case via correspondence from the current Foreign Secretary to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. There is no law that stops civil servants sensibly flagging UKSV recommendations while protecting detailed sensitive vetting information to allow ministers to make judgments on appointments or to explain matters to Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the government has also changed the direct ministerial appointments process so that due diligence is now required as standard. The Prime Minister has also changed the process so that public announcements about direct ministerial appointments can now not be made until security vetting has been completed. Mr. Speaker, clearly what came to light about Peter Mandelson following the release of files by the United States Department for Justice was deeply disturbing. In February this year, the Prime Minister instructed officials to carry out a review of the national security vetting process to ensure it is fit for purpose. I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that the terms of reference for that review have now been updated to include the means by which all decisions are made in relation to national security vetting. The government has appointed Sir Adrian Fulford to lead this review, and for completeness has separately asked the Government Security Group in the Cabinet Office to look at any security concerns raised during Peter Mandelson's tenure as Ambassador to the United States, in answer to the question raised by the Honourable Member for Bromsgrove. We will publish terms of reference, and the Government commits to returning to the House on its findings and recommendations. Mr. Speaker, just two other questions that were raised during the debate. One, there has been accusations made of the Prime Minister, both in this House of misleading and outside of this House of lying. That has been shown today by evidence in the Foreign Affairs Select Committee to be not true in any way. And I am sure the House will be as concerned as I am that whilst officials felt unable to provide this information to ministers, this information was made available to the Guardian newspaper. As a consequence of that, I can confirm that a leak inquiry is now underway. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I thank Right Honourable and Honourable Members for their contributions to today's debate. This is my 6th address to this House on the appointment of Peter Mandelson as Ambassador to the United States of America. I recognise the House will want to know about the next steps in respect of the publication of the remainder of the information relevant to the humble address that was not included in the first tranche. I commit to the House that we will release this further material shortly, subject to the processes ongoing with the Metropolitan Police and the Intelligence and Security Committee, and we will continue to keep members updated as we make progress. Mr. Speaker, I commend the statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me start by thanking members from across the House for speaking in this debate today. We heard many powerful statements. I'm particularly grateful to the many speakers on my side, including the members for Chingford, Ruislip, Goole, Morden and Weald. I found myself nodding along to the member for Leeds East, the first time I think that has ever happened. But, Mr. Speaker, we heard very good speeches from the member for North Herefordshire, from Largan Valley, East Wiltshire, St Neots, North Antrim. This is membership from all sides of the House giving powerful statements. Members of all parties who know that this story doesn't add up. We have also heard some statements supporting the Prime Minister, which can only be described as brave. As I said when I opened the debate, I do feel for the Minister sent here today on the Prime Minister's behalf. He is the latest person to have to carry the can for the Prime Minister's mistakes. He could never have given this House the answers it deserved to hear about what is, at its core, a failure of the Prime Minister's judgment, a failure of the Prime Minister to follow process, and a shocking failure of the Prime Minister to take responsibility for his own mistakes. Not just apologise, take responsibility. The Minister could not answer why the Prime Minister decided to appoint Peter Mandelson to our most important diplomatic role, despite many members asking, in full knowledge from the due diligence that Mandelson was a security risk. He could not answer why the Prime Minister chose to ignore the Cabinet Secretary and appoint Peter Mandelson before he received vetting. That was clearly not the process at the time, despite what the Minister is saying at the dispatch box. He's saying they changed the process. The advice in November 2024 was to carry out the security vetting. So what process are they changing? One he's just making up. He could not answer why the Prime Minister put the Foreign Office under constant pressure to approve the appointment. He could not answer why Number 10 were dismissive of the entire vetting process. He could not answer why Number 10 also asked for the disgraced Matthew Doyle to be made an ambassador and hid this from the Foreign Secretary. And he could not answer why the Prime Minister sacked Olly Robbins if he was following a process which he claims was there already. Doesn't make any sense. He couldn't answer because only one man can. That man is not here today. I do not know whether he thinks he is above answering these questions. We'll try again tomorrow. I do not know whether he still somehow thinks that he did nothing wrong, but I'll tell you what I do know. The Prime Minister has put the country's national security at risk. He is not fit for office. He must take responsibility. It is time for him to go.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye? Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Point of order, Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And firstly, I'd like to apologise for not being able to give you advance notice of this point of order. I asked if the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister could answer the question which I've been trying to get repeatedly, and I would like your advice, Mr. Speaker, on how I get an answer to that, is to the question of did Morgan McSweeney have security clearance at the time he was involved in the Mandelson appointment? And so if we could have an answer to that question either now in writing and you could advise me, I'd be grateful, Mr. Speaker.
What I would say is, look, we aren't going to carry on the debate, and I know the member's been here long enough. He will pursue it, and I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have heard that he doesn't feel he's had an answer, but I certainly know it won't be the end of it. Right. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I'd like to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary.